There are rules in the desert that nobody writes down. Don't whistle after dark. Don't look at it if you see it. And if something calls your name in a voice you recognize, don't answer, because the voice isn't theirs. Whatever's using it already knows where you are. Welcome to Nocturnal Dread. Tonight, we bring you 10 true and deeply disturbing Skinwalker encounter horror stories from the highways and the Hogans and the high desert of the Navajo Nation. Stay until the end. The last story will change how you think about what protects you. I grew up on a cattle ranch outside of Gallup, New Mexico, about 15 miles from the Navajo reservation border, on a piece of land that my grandfather purchased in 1971 from a rancher who was moving to Albuquerque because his wife had decided that 40 years of living in a place where the nearest grocery store was a 30-minute drive and the nearest hospital was an hour was enough, and that the remaining years of her life would be spent in a place where the infrastructure of modern civilization was closer than the horizon. My grandfather understood the decision without sharing it. He was half Navajo on his mother's side and half Anglo on his father's, a combination that in the Four Corners region produces a person who is comfortable in both worlds and fully claimed by neither, the particular, boundary-straddling identity that mixed heritage people in the Southwest develop when they grow up between cultures that have been occupying the same landscape for different reasons and with different relationships to the land for centuries. The ranch is about 4,000 acres, which sounds like a lot, and which, in the high desert of northwestern New Mexico, is barely enough to sustain a modest cattle operation because the land is dry and the grass is sparse, and the carrying capacity of arid rangeland is a fraction of what green country ranchers achieve on properties a tenth the size. The terrain is a mixture of flat scrubland and shallow canyon and mesa. The particular geography that the Colorado Plateau produces in this part of New Mexico, the land cut by arroyos that run with water during the monsoon and that are dry creek beds the rest of the year, the soil sandy and red and dotted with sagebrush and camisa, and the scattered juniper and pinon that constitute the tree cover in a landscape where trees are a luxury that the rainfall doesn't reliably support. I was raised on the ranch. I went to school in Gallup, the 30-minute bus ride each way that rural kids in the Southwest accept the way urban kids accept the subway, as the daily commute that geography imposes on education. But the ranch was home. The 4,000 acres and the cattle and the horses and the particular vast, sky-dominated, silence-saturated quality of life that high desert ranching produces, when the nearest neighbor is 3 miles away and the nearest town is 15, and the landscape in every direction is the same rolling, treeless, wind-exposed expanse of scrub and sand and sky. My grandfather taught me the ranch the way his mother's people taught their children the land, through presence and repetition and the slow accumulation of knowledge that comes from being in a place every day and paying attention to what the place shows you. He taught me where the cattle gather in summer and where they drift in winter, and where the water collects after the monsoon, and where the fences need checking, and where the coyotes den, and where the rattlesnakes sun in the spring, and every other piece of practical, land-specific knowledge that 4 decades of ranching had deposited in his memory. He also taught me other things. The things that his mother had taught him, and that her mother had taught her, and that came from the Navajo side of the family, and that operated on principles that the Anglo-ranching world didn't acknowledge, and that the Navajo world didn't explain. The warnings and the prohibitions, and the particular, firm, non-negotiable rules that govern behavior in certain places and at certain times, and in the presence of certain things. He told me 3 things about skinwalkers. He told me on an evening when I was about 12, and old enough to have heard the word at school from Navajo classmates, who used it the way all children use forbidden words, with excitement and fear and the thrilling uncertainty of not knowing how much of what you're saying is real. I asked him what a skinwalker was. He was quiet for a while. Then he said 3 things. Don't talk about them. Don't look for them. And if you see a deer standing on 2 legs, go inside and don't come out until morning. He said these 3 things, and he didn't elaborate, and he didn't explain, and the conversation was over, and the subject was closed with the particular, absolute finality that my grandfather brought to topics that he considered non-negotiable. I didn't ask again. The 3 rules went into the part of my mind where rules live, alongside the other rules of the ranch. The practical ones about gates and fences and water, and the ones that came from the Navajo side, and that I followed without fully understanding because my grandfather followed them, and my grandfather understood the land better than anyone I knew. I was 17 in the fall of 2019. September. The monsoon had ended about 3 weeks earlier, and the land was in the brief, green, deceptively lush period that follows the summer rains. The grass has grown tall enough to hide the fence line posts at their bases, and the arroyos still showing the high water marks from the last significant rain. I was checking the east fence after school, the section that runs along the big arroyo where our property borders BLM land, about 2 miles from the house, riding the ATV on the fence line the way I'd been doing since I was 14, and my grandfather decided my judgment was reliable enough to be trusted with fence inspection on my own. The east fence is the most remote section of the property. The terrain drops into the arroyo on the east side and rises to a low mesa on the BLM land beyond. The mesa about a mile across and maybe 200 feet above the arroyo floor. The flat-topped formation that dominates the view from the east pasture and that provides the visual boundary between our land and the federal land that stretches east for miles. The arroyo between our fence and the mesa is about a quarter-mile wide, a shallow canyon with sandy walls and a flat bottom that carries water during the monsoon, and that during the dry season is a sandy wash populated by cottontails and quail and the occasional coyote and the mule deer that move between the mesa and the pastures, depending on where the grazing is. Better. It was about 5:30 in the afternoon. The sun was low but not setting, the September light producing the long shadows and the warm amber quality that the high desert generates in the hour before dusk, the particular golden hour light that photographers come to the Southwest to capture, and that ranchers experience every evening without comment, because it's just the light the land makes when the day is ending. I was on the ATV at the fence line, stopped, checking a section of wire that had been showing slack for about a week, and that I was assessing for repair. I was facing east, looking across the arroyo toward the mesa. I had my binoculars around my neck, the Vortex pair that my grandfather had given me for my 16th birthday, the standard ranch optic that every rancher in the Southwest carries for spotting cattle and checking distant fence, and doing the visual work that a 4,000-acre property requires when the distances are measured in miles. I saw the deer at the edge of the arroyo, about 200 yards out, standing on the far bank where the sandy wall of the arroyo meets the flat scrubland that slopes up toward the mesa. A mule deer doe, the kind I'd seen 1,000 times on the property. The big-eared, gray-brown, cautious animal that is the most common large wildlife on the ranch, and that I'd been watching since I could hold binoculars. The deer was standing at the edge, facing the arroyo, and I raised the binoculars to look, because looking at deer through binoculars is what you do on a ranch when you're 17 and stopped at a fence. And the light is good, and the deer is there. The deer was standing on its hind legs. The binoculars brought the image close enough that the detail was clear and the interpretation was unambiguous. The deer was standing upright, on 2 legs. The hind legs were straight, not bent at the hock the way a deer's hind legs are bent when the animal is standing in its normal quadrupedal posture. The joints that provide the springing mechanism for a deer's running gait, locked and extended in a straight line from hip to hoof, the legs functioning as columns rather than as the angled, spring-loaded structure that deer anatomy produces. The body was vertical, the torso was upright, the spine straight, the chest facing the arroyo, the animal standing the way a person stands, the weight distributed on 2 legs with the balance that bipedal posture requires, and that quadrupedal animals do not possess, because their skeletal structure is not designed for sustained upright stance. The head was turned toward me. Not the casual, ear-flicking peripheral awareness that deer display when they've detected a presence and are assessing whether the presence is a threat. The head was turned fully toward me with the chin level, the ears forward, and the eyes directed at me across 200 yards of desert scrub with a focus and a steadiness that I had never seen a deer produce. Deer don't look at you like that. Deer look around you, their eyes set on the sides of the skull to provide the wide-angle peripheral vision that prey animals need for predator detection. This deer was looking at me, directly. The eyes pointed at me the way a person's eyes point at something they're studying, the binocular focus that forward-facing eyes produce when attention is directed at a single object. I held the binoculars on the deer for about 10 seconds. The deer did not move. The standing posture was not a momentary rearing, not the brief, startled elevation that deer sometimes produce when they encounter something unexpected. The deer was standing with the settled, stable, unhurried quality of a posture that was being maintained voluntarily. The animal balanced on 2 legs with the ease that suggested the posture was not unusual for it, not the straining, unstable wobble that a quadruped produces when it's forced into an upright position that its anatomy doesn't support. The deer was comfortable on 2 legs. The posture was natural. For whatever this was, I lowered the binoculars. The deer was still visible to the naked eye, a shape at the arroyo's edge, Smaller without the magnification, but still clearly upright, still clearly standing on two legs, still clearly facing me with the direct, evaluative, sustained attention that I could feel across the distance, the way you can feel someone watching you in a room even when you're not looking at them. The sensation was not the neutral, analytical awareness that wildlife observation produces. The sensation was being watched, being assessed, being looked at by something that was making decisions about me based on what it was seeing. My grandfather's voice was in my head. If you see a deer standing on two legs, go inside and don't come out until morning. The rule that I'd carried for 5 years without needing it. The warning that had lived in the part of my mind where rules live, unused, untested, theoretical, was now operative. The rule applied. The deer was standing on two legs. The rule said to go inside. I went inside. I started the ATV, and I rode the 2 miles back to the house at full speed, which, on the ranch terrain, is about 25 miles per hour, the maximum that the ATV can sustain on the uneven ground without risking a rollover on the ruts and the rocks that the pasture road produces. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I rode to the house, and I parked the ATV in the barn, and I went inside, and I locked the door, and I didn't come out until morning. My grandfather was in the kitchen when I came in. He looked at my face, and he didn't ask what happened, and I didn't tell him. And the not asking and the not telling constituted a communication that was as clear as any words would have been. He knew. Not the specifics, the category. He knew I'd seen something that activated the rules he'd given me 5 years earlier. He made dinner. We ate. He didn't mention the east pasture. He didn't ask about the fence. He didn't reference the binoculars that were still around my neck because I'd forgotten to take them off. He went to bed at his usual time. I went to bed, and I didn't sleep. And the night was long, and the house was quiet, and the desert outside the windows was dark and vast. And I listened to the silence. And I thought about the deer that was standing on two legs at the edge of the arroyo, 200 yards from the east fence. I checked the fence the next afternoon. I rode the ATV to the east pasture, and I checked the section I'd been inspecting when I saw the deer. The wire was still slack. I repaired it. I looked across the arroyo to the spot where the deer had been standing. The ground showed tracks. Deer tracks. Mule deer hoof prints in the sandy soil at the edge of the arroyo. The split-hoofed impressions that deer leave in soft ground. The tracks were in a pattern that I couldn't reconcile with the anatomy of the animal I'd seen. The prints were paired. 2 hoof prints side by side. The spacing consistent. The depth consistent. The pattern extending from the arroyo's edge toward the mesa in a straight line. Not the alternating, offset pattern that 4-legged locomotion produces. The paired, even pattern that 2-legged locomotion produces. 2 feet, side by side, stepping forward, the prints evenly spaced about 2.5 feet apart, the stride length of a person walking upright across the desert toward the mesa. I didn't follow the tracks. I repaired the fence. I rode back to the house. I told my grandfather about the tracks, but not about the deer. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "Don't check the east fence at dusk anymore. Check it in the morning." I said, "Okay." He said one more thing. He said it was the only time he ever added to the 3 rules he'd given me when I was 12. He said, "If you see it again, don't use the binoculars." He said, "Don't bring it closer than it is." He said some things, and when you bring them close, they stay close. He said that, and then the conversation was over, and the subject was closed. Dee and I have checked the east fence in the morning ever since. I haven't seen the deer again. Not the one that stands on 2 legs. I see mule deer on the east pasture regularly. The normal, 4-legged, properly proportioned animals that graze the scrub and water at the arroyo, and that move between the mesa and the pasture with the seasonal rhythm that deer in the high desert maintain. The deer are deer. They stand on 4 legs. They look at me with the wide-angle, peripheral, prey animal awareness that deer produce. They don't focus on me. They don't direct their attention at me with the sustained, evaluative, forward-facing focus that the deer at the arroyo produced on a September evening in 2019. But I don't check the east fence at dusk. And I don't use the binoculars in the east pasture. And when I'm on the ATV near the arroyo, and the light is going, and the shadows are long, and the desert is beginning its transition from the warm gold of afternoon to the cool blue of evening, I ride back to the house. The way my grandfather told me to. The way the rules require. Because the rules are the rules. And the rules exist because the land contains things that the rules were written for. Things that stand on 2 legs, and that watch from the arroyo's edge, and that leave tracks in the sand that tell you what you already knew, which is that whatever you saw was not a deer, and that the binoculars brought it closer than it should have been, and that the closer you bring it, the closer it stays, and that some distances in the high desert of northwestern New Mexico are maintained not by fences, but by the particular, careful, deliberate practice of not looking, of not asking, of not bringing the thin toe at the edge of the arroyo any closer than 200 yards, because 200 yards, my grandfather would say, is close enough. Any closer than that, and the thing at the edge of the arroyo becomes the thing at the edge of the pasture, and then the thing at the edge of the yard, and then the thing at the edge of the porch, and then you're not checking the fence anymore. The fence is checking you. I drove a school bus on the Navajo Nation for 7 years. The route was between Chinle and a cluster of homes about 20 miles into the canyon country east of town. The particular, remote, deeply traditional part of the reservation, where the families live in the same areas their grandparents lived, and where the roads are unpaved, and the distances between homes are measured in miles, and the landscape is the red sandstone and sage and juniper terrain that the canyon country produces. When the Colorado Plateau drops into the drainages that feed the Chinle Wash, and the arroyos that cut the land into a maze of shallow canyons and flat-topped mesas, and the particular, wind-sculpted, time-exposed geography that makes this part of the Southwest look like another planet to people who didn't grow up in it, and like home to the people who did. The route took about an hour each way. The bus left Chinle at 3:15 in the afternoon, headed east on the paved road for about 6 miles, then turned south onto a dirt road that descended into the canyon country and wound through the terrain for about 14 miles, dropping children at homes that were spaced anywhere from a half mile to 3 miles apart, the stops marked by mailboxes and cattle guards, and the tire tracks that led from the road to the houses that were sometimes visible from the road and sometimes hidden behind a ridge or a stand of juniper, the homes of families that had been living in these canyons since before the roads existed, and that the roads had been built to reach rather than the other way around. I was not Navajo. I was Anglo, a woman from Flagstaff who had taken the bus driving job in 2014 because the school district was hiring and the pay included housing, and the reservation needed drivers who were willing to commit to the remote routes that most. Applicants declined because the roads were rough and the distances were long, and the isolation of driving a school bus 20 miles into the canyon country and 20 miles back every day was more than most people wanted. I wanted it, not because I was brave or adventurous, but because I was 32 and recently divorced and looking for a life that was as different from my previous one as geography could provide. The canyon country of the Navajo Nation is as different from a suburb in Flagstaff as any place in America can be from any other place, and the difference was what I needed. 7 years on the route taught me the land the way that daily repetition teaches anything, through the accumulation of observations that become knowledge that becomes instinct. I learned which roads flooded first in the monsoon, which roads became impassable after a half-inch of rain, and where the sand was deep enough to bog the bus, and where the rock was exposed enough to provide traction. I learned the children and their families, the relationships and the dynamics, and the particular complex, community-level knowledge that a bus driver acquires when she's transporting the same children on the same route for years, and when the children tell her things on the bus that they don't tell other adults because the bus is a liminal space, a moving room between home and school, where the usual rules of disclosure are relaxed by the particular, private, enclosed quality of a vehicle in motion. The children also taught me other things, the things that the land contained and that the families knew about, and that the children reference casually, the way children reference anything that is part of their daily environments, without the self-consciousness that adults bring to subjects that the rational world finds uncomfortable. The children talked about skinwalkers the way children in other places talk about the weather or the traffic, as a feature of the environment that they were aware of, and that they managed through the behaviors that their families had taught them. Don't go outside after dark. Don't whistle at night. Don't look at it if you see it. Don't talk to it if it talks to you. The rules were consistent across families and across generations. And the children followed them with the particular, unquestioning compliance that children bring to rules they've been taught by people they trust, about dangers they believe are real. November of 2021, the afternoon route. I had picked up the children at the school in Chinle at 3:15 and headed east. The bus full with about 18 children ranging in age from 5 to 14, the usual afternoon load, for a route that serves about 12 homes across 20 miles of canyon country. The November sun was already low at 3:15, the day short enough that by the time I reached the midpoint of the route, about 10 miles in, the sun was touching the tops of the mesas to the west, and the shadows in the canyons were deepening, with the speed that November shadows produce, when the angle of the light is acute and the terrain is vertical and the sun drops behind the deep rim of a canyon wall and the canyon floor goes from lit to dark in the space of minutes. I was dropping children in order, the route proceeding south and east along the canyon road, each stop reducing the number on the bus by ones and twos. The children departing at their mailboxes and walking or running to their homes while the bus waited until they were inside or until a parent or a grandparent appeared at the door. The standard safety protocol that the district required and that I followed with particular attention on this route because the homes were isolated and the children were young and the distance between the bus and the house was sometimes 100 yards or more across open ground. By 5 o'clock, I had 3 children left, 2 brothers, ages 6 and 9, whose home was at the next to last stop, about 2 miles ahead, and a girl of about 8 whose home was the last stop on the route, the most remote, about 3 miles past the brother's house at the end of a spur road that dead-ended at a hogan and a frame house on a rise above a dry wash. The sun was below the mesa tops, the canyon road was in shadow, the headlights were on. The road ahead was the particular, unpaved, washboarded, sandy surface that the canyon roads produce in the dry months, the bus bouncing and swaying at about 35 miles per hour, the speed that the road conditions allowed. The girl was sitting in the back of the bus. She was a quiet child, the kind of student who sits alone and looks out the window and doesn't participate in the social noise that school buses produce. She had been on my route for 3 years. I knew her family. Her grandmother, who usually met her at the stop, was a traditional woman who spoke primarily Navajo and who kept sheep and maintained the old practices with the particular, quiet, immovable commitment that traditional Navajo elders bring to the preservation of their way of life. The girl looked out the back window. She said, "There's a dog following us." I checked the mirrors. The bus has 3 mirrors, the large interior rear view, and the 2 exterior side mirrors that provide the driver with visibility along both sides and behind the vehicle. The road behind the bus was visible in the interior mirror, the unpaved surface stretching back into the canyon in the red-amber light of the setting sun. There was an animal on the road, about 50 yards behind the bus, running. My first thought was dog. The reservation has a large population of free-ranging dogs, the animals that live around the homes and the communities, and that sometimes follow vehicles on the road, as rural dogs everywhere follow vehicles. The territorial, habitual, purposeless running that dogs engage in when a vehicle enters their range. A dog following a school bus on a dirt road on the reservation was not unusual. I'd seen it hundreds of times in 7 years, but the proportions were wrong. I looked in the mirror again, adjusting the angle to bring the animal into better focus. The body was low to the ground, the torso horizontal, the legs in motion, the animal running at a speed that was keeping pace with the bus at 35 miles per hour. Dogs on the reservation are generally not capable of sustained running at 35 miles per hour. A healthy, large dog might sprint at that speed for a short distance, 100 yards, maybe 200, before fatigue reduces the speed and the dog falls behind. This animal was not sprinting. The gait was sustained and consistent, the pace matching the bus with the particular, effortless quality of an animal running within its comfortable range rather than at its maximum effort. The legs were too long. The proportion between the leg length and the body length was wrong, the legs extending farther than the body's mass would suggest, the stride covering more ground per cycle than the body size should have allowed. The gait was wrong, the 4-legged lope that dogs and coyotes produce, the asymmetrical, bounding motion where the front legs land together and the rear legs push together, was not what this animal was doing. The motion was different. The front limbs were reaching forward and pulling the body. The rear limbs were pushing, the rhythm suggesting a mechanical relationship between the limbs. That was not the natural coordination of a 4-legged runner, but the adapted, compensatory motion of a body using 4 limbs to do what it more naturally did with 2. The front limb is reaching and pulling. The rear limbs are pushing. The motion was fluid but wrong. The body covered ground at a speed that the gait I was seeing should not have produced. I drove faster. The bus accelerated from 35 to about 40, the maximum that the road conditions permitted without risking the safety of the 3 children on board. The animal accelerated. The distance between the bus and the animal remained about 50 yards. The animal had matched my increase in speed without apparent effort. The gait unchanged, the pace adjusted upward with the fluid automatic calibration of a runner who has more speed available than it's using. The girl said, "That's not a dog." She said it quietly, the way children on the reservation say things about subjects they've been taught to treat with caution, the volume low, the tone matter of fact. The statement delivered with the particular, calm, non-dramatic quality that children produce when they're identifying something they recognize from the instructions their families have given them. She was not frightened. She was identifying. The way a child identifies a rattlesnake or a scorpion, the recognition preceding the fear, the training activating before the emotion, the child's voice producing the identification with the same matter-of-fact certainty that she would use to say that's a coyote or that's a horse, that's not a dog. Said with the calm of a child who knows exactly what it is and who has been taught what to do and who is doing it, which is identifying the thing without naming it and without looking at it any longer than necessary. I delivered the two brothers at their stop. I didn't wait for them to reach the house. I watched them start walking, and I closed the door, and I drove. The girl had moved from the back of the bus to the front, sitting in the seat directly behind me, the seat closest to the driver, the position that children choose when they want to be near the adult. She was not looking out the back window anymore. She was looking forward, at the road ahead, at the 3 miles remaining between the brothers' stop and her home. I checked the mirror. The animal was still there, 50 yards back, the same pace, the same wrong gait, the same proportions that didn't match any animal I could identify. The light was failing, the canyon in deep shadow, the headlights providing the only illumination ahead, while the mirrors showed the animal in the last red light of the day, the body low and dark, and running with the fluid, mechanical, wrong motion that had been consistent for the last 11 miles. 11 miles. The animal had been following the bus for 11 miles. From the point where the girl first noticed it, approximately at the midpoint of the route, to the brothers' stop, 11 miles. 11 miles at speeds between 35 and 40 miles per hour. No dog can maintain that pace for that distance. No coyote. No animal that I knew of in the fauna of the Navajo Nation could run at 40 miles per hour for 11 miles on an unpaved road behind a school bus without showing fatigue or falling behind or breaking stride. I reached the cattle guard at the turnoff to the girls' spur road. The cattle guard is a standard installation, a grid of steel pipes set into a concrete frame across the road, the gap between the pipes wide enough that cattle hooves fall through and narrow enough that vehicle tires roll across, the standard livestock barrier that prevents cattle from crossing between grazing areas. I drove across the cattle guard. The steel pipes rattled under the bus tires with the familiar, clattering metallic sound that cattle guards produce. I checked the mirror. The animal had stopped. It was standing on the road about 10 yards from the cattle guard, on the far side, the side I'd just left. The animal was standing, on 4 legs, motionless. The head was raised, and the body was still. Elle and the animal was looking at the cattle guard the way a person looks at a barrier, not with the confusion that an animal would show, but with the evaluative, assessing attention of an intelligence encountering an obstacle and deciding whether to cross it. The animal did not cross. It stood on the far side of the cattle guard for about 30 seconds, visible in my mirrors as I drove the spur road toward the girl's home. The distance between the bus and the animal increasing with every second, the animal shrinking in the mirror as the road curved, and the terrain intervened, and the animal became a shape on the road behind the cattle guard, motionless, watching, and then the curve took it out of my mirror's view, and the animal was gone. I delivered the girl to her home. Her grandmother was at the door. The girl got off the bus and walked to the house, S.E., and she said something to her grandmother in Navajo that I didn't understand. The grandmother looked at me. She looked at the road behind the bus. She looked at the spur road and the direction I'd come from, and the cattle guard that was 3 miles back and not visible from the house. She said something to the girl, and the girl went inside, and the grandmother looked at me one more time and nodded and went inside and closed the door. I drove back to Chinle. I crossed the cattle guard on the way back. There was nothing on the road. The animal was gone. The road was empty in both directions, the canyon dark, the headlights cutting through the dust, the bus empty, and the route complete, and the 11 miles of pursuit over. I drove the route the next day, and the day after that, and every school day for the remaining year and a half before I left the reservation in the spring of 2023. The animal did not appear again. The route was the same, the road was the same, the canyon country was the same canyon country that it had been for the 7 years I'd been driving through it. Nothing changed. Nothing followed. The cattle guard was a cattle guard. D and the road was a road. And the children got on and got off, and the bus made its daily transit through the canyon country without incidents. But I think about the cattle guard. The steel pipes in the concrete frame that the animal would not cross. Cattle guards work because cattle won't step on a surface that their hooves can fall through. The instinct of a four-legged animal recognizing the danger that the gaps between the pipes represent. Dogs cross cattle guards. Coyotes cross cattle guards. The four-legged animals that are smart enough to understand that the gaps are narrow and the crossing is safe cross cattle guards without hesitation. The animal that followed my bus for 11 miles at 40 miles per hour would not cross a cattle guard that any dog or coyote would cross without breaking stride. The animal stopped at the steel pipes in the concrete frame. D looked at the barrier and chose not to cross, because the animal was not what it appeared to be. And whatever it was, the cattle guard was not a livestock barrier. It was something else. A boundary. A line that the thing behind the bus recognized and respected, or feared, or was unable to cross for reasons that have nothing to do with hooves and gaps and the physics of four-legged locomotion, and everything to do with the rules that govern the things that run on the roads of the canyon, country at dusk, and that follow school buses for 11 miles, and that stop at cattle guards because cattle guards are made of steel, and steel, in the traditional understanding that the girl's grandmother carries, is a barrier that certain things cannot cross, not because their feet won't fit between the pipes, because the steel itself is the boundary, and the thing behind the bus knew it. My grandmother lived alone in a hogan about 4 miles from the nearest paved road on the Navajo reservation near Kayenta, Arizona. The hogan was the traditional kind, the female hogan, the round, earth-covered structure that Navajo families have been building since before the Europeans arrived, and that traditional Navajo people continue to live in, because the hogan is not just a house but a sacred space, the structure oriented, with its door facing east to receive the morning sun, the interior organized according to the cardinal directions that Navajo cosmology assigns to the activities of daily life. My grandmother's hogan had been built in the 1960s by her husband, my grandfather, who had died in 1998 and who had constructed the hogan with the logs and the earth, and the particular, practiced, traditional methods that Navajo men learned from their fathers, the building process itself, a ceremony, the structure, a physical expression of the relationship between the family and the land, and the spiritual framework that gives both meaning. My grandmother had lived in the hogan for 60 years by the summer of 2020. 60 years of daily occupation, the kind of tenure that transforms a dwelling into an extension of the person who inhabits it, the space absorbing the habits and the rhythms and the particular, accumulated identity of a woman who had been waking in the same structure and sleeping in the same structure and conducting the ceremonies of daily life in the same structure for 6 decades. The hogan was my grandmother. The smoke-darkened ceiling beams, the packed earth floor worn smooth by 60 years of footsteps, the east-facing door that she opened every morning to greet the dawn, the interior that held the smell of cedar and juniper and the wool of the sheep that she had been tending since before I was born. The space was as personal as skin and as familiar as breath. She lived alone. This was not unusual for traditional Navajo elders in the remote parts of the reservation, the women who had outlived their husbands, and whose children had moved to the border towns for work, and who maintained their homes and their sheep and their daily practices in the isolation that the reservation's vast, unpopulated terrain provides. My grandmother's nearest neighbor was about 2 miles south, an elderly man who ran a few cattle on the sparse rangeland, and who checked on my grandmother occasionally, the way remote neighbors check on each other, not with daily visits, but with the periodic, practical, mutual awareness that people in isolated places maintain because the isolation requires it. The nearest town was Kayenta, about 20 miles west on the paved road that my grandmother reached, by driving 4 miles of unpaved road in the pickup truck that my uncle had given her when he moved to Flagstaff. I visited her every summer. I'm her granddaughter, the daughter of her youngest son, and I grew up in Phoenix, which is about 6 hours south of Kayenta, and which might as well be another country in terms of the distance between the life I lived in the city and the life my grandmother lived in the hogan on the reservation. The summer visits were the bridge between those two worlds. The 2 weeks each July when I drove from Phoenix to Kayenta, and then the 4 miles of unpaved road to the hogan, and entered the world that my grandmother maintained, the traditional world, the world where the sheep needed tending, and the fire needed feeding, and the ceremonies needed performing, and the particular, quiet, deliberate pace of traditional Navajo life replaced the noise and the speed and the distraction of the city. The summer of 2020 was different. I arrived in early July, the way I always arrived, driving the unpaved road to the hogan in the afternoon, the red dust rising behind the truck, the mesa visible to the north, the hogan appearing at the end of the road the way it always appeared, the round, earth-covered structure with the east-facing door, and the sheep corral beside it, and the pickup truck parked under the shade structure, and the dogs lying in the shade. Everything looked the same. My grandmother looked the same, the Hogan looked the same. But when I sat down with her that evening, she made the coffee that she made every evening. And we sat in the chairs outside the door watching the sun go down behind the mesa. She told me that something had been coming to the Hogan at night. She told me calmly, the particular, measured, matter-of-fact calm that traditional Navajo elders bring to subjects that the Western world would treat with alarm or disbelief, or the particular, uncomfortable dismissiveness that modernity brings to anything it can't explain. My grandmother was not alarmed. She was informing me. The way she would inform me was that the well pump needed repair, or that the sheep had been bothered by coyotes. She was telling me about a condition that existed and that she was managing, and that she wanted me to know about because I was staying for 2 weeks, and the condition would be present during my stay. She said it came about twice a week. She said it came at night, after dark, usually between midnight and 3 in the morning. She said it walked around the Hogan in a circle, counterclockwise. She said the word in Navajo for counterclockwise, and she said it with a particular emphasis that indicated the direction was significant. The counterclockwise motion being the direction that traditional Navajo practice associates with witchcraft and death and the reversal of the natural order, the anti-sunwise direction that the ceremonies prohibit, and that the presence of the direction in any context is a warning that the thing producing it is operating outside the boundaries of the natural world. She said it scratched on the walls. She said the scratching was deliberate, not the random contact of an animal brushing against the structure, but the intentional, sustained scratching of something that was using the sound to announce its presence, the way a person knocks on a door to indicate that they want entry. The scratching moved around the Hogan with a counterclockwise circuit, the sound traveling along the wall from position to position as the thing outside walked its circle. She said it spoke to her. She said it spoke through the door, the east-facing door that she kept locked at night with a heavy wooden bar that my grandfather had installed when the Hogan was built. She said the voice came through the door as if the speaker were standing directly outside, the sound clear and close, the voice positioned at the height that a standing person's mouth would occupy relative to the door's surface. She said the voice was her sister's. Her sister, my great-aunt, had died in 2014 of complications from diabetes, the slow, diminishing illness that the reservation's health conditions produce, with a regularity that the medical system acknowledges, and that the community absorbs as one of the costs of living in a place where the healthcare is inadequate, the diet is poor, and the nearest hospital is hours away. Her sister had been dead for 6 years, and her sister's voice was speaking through the door of the Hogan twice a week at 2 in the morning. She said the voice called her by her Navajo name. I need to explain what this means because the significance is not apparent to people outside the culture. In traditional Navajo practice, a person has multiple names. The English name that appears on documents and is used in public, and the Navajo name, the sacred name that is given in a ceremony and that carries spiritual power and that is known only to the immediate family and that is not spoken publicly because the name is a direct connection to the person's spiritual identity. The speaking of the Navajo name by an unauthorized entity is not just a violation of privacy, it is a spiritual act. The name gives access. The speaking of the name by the wrong entity is an attempt to use the power of the name to gain entry, to establish a connection, to create a relationship that the person has not consented to. Whatever was outside the Hogan knew my grandmother's Navajo name. It spoke the name through the door in the voice of her dead sister. I was called to her by the name that only family knew. My grandmother told me she knew what it was. She used a word in Navajo that I recognized from childhood, a word that my father had told me never to say aloud, a word that refers to a specific kind of entity in Navajo belief, a person who has chosen a particular path of power that requires the violation of the most fundamental taboos of Navajo life. She said the word once, and she told me not to repeat it, and I have not repeated it, and I will not repeat it here. She said it had been a man from a community about 30 miles south, a man she had known, not well, but in the way that people on the reservation know each other across distances, because the communities are small and the connections between them are maintained through ceremony and clan, and the particular, distributed, kinship-based social network that Navajo life produces. She said the man had chosen the wrong path. She said the path he had chosen gave him abilities that the natural world does not provide, and that the abilities came at a cost that the man had been willing to pay, and that the cost included the loss of his humanity in a way that was not metaphorical but literal, the man becoming something that was no longer a man, and that used the abilities to harm and to take and to exercise the power that the path provided. She said she was not afraid. She said it with a particular, quiet, absolute certainty that my grandmother brought to every statement about matters of spiritual importance. The certainty of a woman who had been practicing the traditional ways for 80 years, and who understood the spiritual landscape of the reservation the way she understood the physical landscape, completely, intimately, with the knowledge that comes from a lifetime of daily attention. She said she had protection. She said the protection was older than the thing outside. She said the protection had been in the Hogan since it was built, placed there by my grandfather during the construction, the traditional protections that Navajo Hogans receive as part of the building process, the prayers and the offerings, and the particular spiritual safeguards that ensure the Hogan is a sacred space that the wrong things cannot enter. I stayed with her for a week, 7 nights in the Hogan, sleeping on the cot that she set up for me against the south wall, the position that the Hogan's directional organization assigns to visitors. The first 2 nights were quiet. The dogs slept outside. The sheep were in the corral. The Hogan was dark and warm, and the packed earth floor was solid beneath the cot, and the ceiling beams were dark shapes above me, and the silence was the particular, enormous, the high desert silence that the reservation produces when you're 4 miles from the nearest road and 20 miles from the nearest town. And the night sky is a dome of stars so dense that the darkness between them seems accidental. The third night, I heard the footsteps. The sound was outside the Hogan. On the ground. The packed earth that surrounds the structure is the area that my grandmother swept every morning with a bundle of sagebrush. The footsteps were distinct, not the padding of a dog's paws or the clicking of a coyote's nails on hard ground. Footsteps, the particular, weight-bearing, rhythmic sound that a person makes when they are walking on packed earth with purpose and without urgency. The footsteps were moving counterclockwise around the Hogan. I could track the sound as it traveled along the wall to my left, past the door, along the wall to my right, behind me and back to my left. A complete circuit. The footsteps were about 3 feet from the wall, the proximity of a person walking a tight circle around a structure, close enough that the sound was clear, and the position was identifiable at every point in the circuit. I looked at my grandmother. She was in her bed, on the west side of the Hogan, the position that the directional organization assigns to the head of the household. She was awake. Her eyes were open. She was looking at the ceiling. She was not looking at the wall. She was not tracking the sound. She was lying still, with the composed, deliberate stillness of a person who is awake and aware, and who is choosing not to react because reaction is what the thing outside wants, and the withholding of reaction is the first defense. The footsteps completed 3 circuits. Then the scratching began. The sound of something drawn across the exterior of the Hogan wall. A sharp, deliberate, sustained scratching that moved with the footsteps, the sound traveling counterclockwise around the structure at the height of about 4 feet, the height that a hand would reach if the hand were being dragged along the wall by a person who was walking the circuit and who was touching the wall as they walked. The scratching was not random. The pressure was consistent. The speed was consistent. The scratching was a deliberate, intentional, communicative act, the sound equivalent of a knock, the announcement of presence. Then the voice. From the door, the east-facing door with the heavy wooden bar across it. A voice that I recognized. My great-aunt's voice. The voice of a woman who had been dead for 6 years. The voice was speaking Navajo. The voice was calling my grandmother's name. Not her English name, her Navajo name. The sacred name that I had heard spoken aloud fewer than 10 times in my life. Always in ceremony, always with reverence, always by family members who had the right to speak it. The voice said the name, and then the voice said other things. Sentences in Navajo that I understood partially, my Navajo being the limited, conversational level competency of a city-raised grandchild who had learned enough from summer visits to follow basic conversation, but not enough to understand the rapid, fluent, traditional Navajo that the voice was producing. The voice was asking to come in. The voice was saying it was cold. The voice was saying it had come a long way. The voice was using the particular, familial, intimate tone that my great-aunt had used when speaking to my grandmother, the tone of a sister talking to a sister, the warmth and the familiarity and the particular, shared, lifelong closeness that sisters produce when they've been sisters for 7 decades. My grandmother said nothing. She lay in her bed, and she looked at the ceiling, Nung, and she did not respond to the voice. She did not acknowledge it. She did not engage with it. The voice continued for about 10 minutes, the tone shifting from warm to insistent, to something that was not quite angry, but that contained a quality that was harder and colder than my great-aunt's voice had ever contained in life. The particular, pressured quality of something that is not getting what it wants, and that is beginning to show the limits of its patience. My grandmother reached under her pillow. She removed a small pouch, a medicine bag, and the leather pouch that traditional Navajo people carry as personal spiritual protection. She held it in her hand. She said 4 words in Navajo, quietly, not to the voice, not to me, to the Hogan, to the space, to the protections that were built into the structure. The voice stopped. The scratching stopped. The footsteps made one more circuit, faster than before, the pace accelerating from the measured walk to something closer to a run, the feet hitting the packed earth with a force that I felt through the floor of the Hogan. Then the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was different from the silence that had preceded the visit. The silence before had been the natural, enormous silence of the desert at night. The silence after was the silence of departure, the acoustic evidence of something that had been present and was now gone, the space it had occupied returning to normal, the way a room returns to normal after someone leaves it. My grandmother looked at me. She said in English, "Go back to sleep." She said it the way she said everything about this subject, calmly, practically, without drama. She said the protection holds. She said it has always held. She said it will hold after she is gone, because the protection is in the Hogan. and the Hogan is the protection, and the man who built it placed the protections there, and the protections are older than the thing outside. I went back to sleep. Eventually, the remaining 4 nights of my stay, I heard the footsteps twice more, the counterclockwise circuit, the scratching, the voice, my grandmother's silence, the medicine bag, the 4 words, the departure, the routine of a siege that had been going on for months, and that my grandmother managed the way she managed everything on the property, with competence and practice and the particular, unshakable confidence of a woman who understood the threat and who possessed the tools to meet it. I left after a week. I drove back to Phoenix. I called my grandmother every Sunday. She never mentioned the visits again. She died in 2022, at the age of 84, in the Hogan where she had lived for 60 years. She died in her sleep, in the bed on the west side, in the position that the directional organization assigns to the head of the household. The Hogan was intact. The door was barred. The medicine bag was under her pillow. My uncle, who handled the arrangements, told me that the area around the Hogan showed tracks in the packed earth. The tracks were fresh. They circled the Hogan counterclockwise. The tracks were canine in shape. The spacing was bipedal. The tracks circled the Hogan 3 times and then led away to the south, toward the community 30 miles away, where the man my grandmother knew had lived, and where the man, according to my uncle, had died about a month before my grandmother. My uncle said the tracks were the last ones. He said no new tracks appeared after my grandmother's death. Whatever had been circling the Hogan had stopped coming, because the person it had been coming for was gone, or because the person it had been coming for had gone somewhere that the thing on the outside could not follow. Because of the protection, my grandmother had said, she was older than the thing outside, and older things, in the world that my grandmother understood, and that I am only beginning to understand, have authority over the things that came after them, even the things that walk counterclockwise around hogs and speak in the voices of the dead and call you by the name that only family knows. Even those things answer to something older, and my grandmother knew what the older thing was, and she held it under her pillow, and it held. I'm a long-haul trucker based out of Albuquerque, and I've been running routes through the Four Corners region for about 12 years, which is long enough to know every mile of every highway in the quadrant where New Mexico and Arizona and Utah and Colorado meet, and long enough to have developed the particular, experienced, road-calibrated awareness that long-haul drivers develop when they've been covering the same territory for more than a decade. The awareness is not just about the road. It's about the landscape, the weather patterns, the traffic rhythms, the way the light changes across a 12-hour shift, and the way the body adapts to the nocturnal schedule that overnight routes require. I drive at night. Most of my runs are the overnight loads. The freight that needs to be in Flagstaff by morning or in Farmington by dawn. The time-sensitive cargo that the daytime drivers don't take, because the daytime drivers have families, and the nighttime drivers have the particular, solitary, sleep-inverted lives that long-haul trucking produces. When the work happens between sunset and sunrise, and the world you occupy is the cab of a Kenworth and the highway and the darkness, and whatever the headlights reach. The route I was running on the night in question was the westbound I-40 run, Albuquerque to Flagstaff, about 320 miles of interstate that crosses the width of New Mexico and the eastern third of Arizona, the route that follows the old Route 66 corridor through Grants and Gallup, and across the Navajo reservation to Holbrook and then southwest to Flagstaff. The route is one of the major east-west freight corridors in the Southwest. Busy during the day with commercial and passenger traffic, thinning significantly after midnight, the traffic reducing to the long-haul trucks and the occasional passenger vehicle until the road becomes, in the hours between 2 and 5 in the morning, one of the emptiest stretches of interstate in the country, particularly on the reservation. The 100-mile section between Gallup and Holbrook crosses the Navajo Nation through terrain that is high desert in the purest sense, flat and treeless and vast. The mesas visible in the distance during the day and invisible at night except as darker shapes against the dark sky, the landscape producing the particular, overwhelming quality of isolation that the high desert imposes when you're driving through it at 2 in the morning, and the nearest town is 30 miles in any direction, and the nearest human being is potentially the driver of the next truck, and the next truck might be 10 miles ahead or 20 miles behind. March of 2022. A Wednesday night. I'd loaded in Albuquerque at 6 in the evening and departed at 7, the standard schedule that puts me on the reservation section of I-40 around midnight and in Flagstaff by about 4:30 in the morning. The load was auto parts, a standard dry van load, nothing unusual. The weather was clear. The temperature was in the low 30s, typical for March at the elevation that the reservation maintains, about 6,000 feet. The high desert cold that drops sharply after sunset and that produces frost on the windshield and the particular crystalline clarity of air that cold desert nights provide when there's no moisture and no cloud cover, and the visibility is limited only by the curvature of the earth and the reach of your headlights. I passed through Gallup at about 12:30. The town was quiet. The way Gallup is quiet after midnight, the truck stops lit, and the main strip showing the closed storefronts and the empty parking lots, and the scattered traffic that a town of 20,000 produces at the lowest hour of the night. I fueled at the Pilot on the west side of town, the standard fuel stop on the westbound run, and pulled back onto I-40 heading west at about 12:45. The reservation began almost immediately. The New Mexico-Arizona border and the Navajo Nation boundary both crossed within the first few miles west of Gallup, the landscape transitioning from the marginal urbanization of the Gallup outskirts to the open, unlit, undeveloped high desert that the reservation maintains, because the reservation is 1.5 million acres of land that has never been developed, and that shows, at night, the absolute darkness that undeveloped land produces when there are no towns and no streetlights and no commercial development, and the only light is the sky and the headlights and the occasional distant glow of a home or a chapter house, miles from the road. I was at about mile marker 311 when I saw the figure. The time was approximately 2 in the morning. I know the mile marker because I track my position habitually, the way all long-haul drivers track their position. The mile markers providing the navigation framework that drivers use to calculate arrival times and fuel stops, and the incremental progress that a 300-mile run requires the driver to monitor. Mile marker 311 is approximately 30 miles west of Gallup and approximately 30 miles east of Window Rock, which is the capital of the Navajo Nation, and at 2 in the morning, it is a town of about 3,000 people who are asleep. The highway at mile marker 311 is straight and flat and dark, the terrain showing nothing but the scrubland and the distant mesas and the enormous sky and the road extending ahead into the darkness with the particular vertiginous quality that straight desert highways produce at night when the headlights reach a few hundred feet, and beyond that distance there's nothing but the dark. The figure was on the right shoulder, standing, facing the highway. The headlights picked up the figure at about 300 feet, the distance at which the high beams resolve a standing human shape from the general darkness of the roadside. The figure was wearing dark clothing, a jacket or a coat, the kind of layered, dark, indistinct clothing that absorbs headlight and that makes roadside figures difficult to assess at speed. The figure was standing at the edge of the shoulder, maybe 2 feet from the travel lane, the position that a hitchhiker assumes when they want to be visible to oncoming traffic without being in the road. No vehicle was visible near the figure. No car on the shoulder, no truck in the median, no breakdown that would explain a person standing on the side of I-40 at 2 in the morning, 30 miles from the nearest town in either direction. I slowed. This was instinct, not intention. A figure on the shoulder at night triggers the driver's trained response of speed reduction and assessment, the evaluation of the roadside situation that determines whether the figure is a hazard, a motorist in distress, or a hitchhiker. The company policy is clear. Don't stop for hitchhikers. The policy is clear because the liability is clear. And because the situations that produce hitchhikers on empty desert highways at 2 in the morning are situations that long-haul drivers are trained to avoid. I slowed from about 65 to about 40, the speed reduction that allows assessment without commitment, the driver looking at the figure, and the figure looking at the driver, and the decision being made in the seconds that the speed and the distance provide. The figure raised a hand. The gesture was clear in the headlights, the right arm extending from the body and the hand opening in the universal signal that means stop, help, I need something from you. The gesture was slow, deliberate, not the frantic waving of a person in distress. The measured, unhurried, almost casual raising of a hand by a figure that was not panicked and not in a hurry, and that was flagging me down with the particular, patient confidence of someone who expected the truck to stop. I didn't stop. The assessment that the training provides and that the instinct confirms overrode the momentary impulse that the raised hand produced. A person on the shoulder of I-40 at 2 in the morning with no vehicle and no visible explanation for their presence is not a person I stop for. The company says so. The training says so. The 12 years of driving say so. I pressed the accelerator and began to bring the truck back up from 40 toward the cruising speed of 65. I passed the figure on my right side, the truck's cab about 10 feet from the shoulder where the figure was standing. I checked my driver's side mirror. The mirror shows the road behind and to the left, the convex surface providing a wide-angle view that includes the shoulder and the lane, and the road extending back into the darkness behind the truck. The figure was visible in the mirror, receding as the truck pulled away, the dark shape on the shoulder getting smaller as the distance increased. The figure was running, not jogging, not the shuffling, uncoordinated motion of a person starting to move after standing still. Running. The figure had transitioned from standing to full sprint in the time it took me to pass and check the mirror, maybe 3 seconds. The figure now in motion on the shoulder, running in the direction I was traveling, running behind the truck. The figure was matching my speed. I was at about 40 miles per hour, still accelerating back toward cruising speed. The figure was keeping pace. The distance between the truck and the figure was not increasing. The figure was running at 40 miles per hour on the shoulder of I-40 inches the dark. I accelerated. The truck moved from 40 to 45 to 50. The figure kept pace. The mirror showed the shape running with a stride that covered the ground at a rate that the speed demanded, the legs extending in a full sprint that matched the truck's acceleration. The figure running at 50 miles per hour on the shoulder of a desert highway at 2 in the morning. No human being runs at 50 miles per hour. The world record for human sprinting speed is about 27 miles per hour, produced in the 100-meter dash by athletes whose bodies are engineered for exactly that purpose, and who maintain that speed for about 10 seconds before the body's energy systems are overwhelmed. 50 miles per hour is nearly double the maximum human sprint speed. The figure was maintaining 50 miles per hour on an unpaved shoulder in dark clothing in the middle of the night. I pushed to 60. The engine responded, the Kenworth's diesel climbing the power band with the steady, mechanical authority that a loaded truck produces when the driver demands acceleration. The truck reached 60 miles per hour. The figure in the mirror was still there, still running, still on the shoulder. The distance between us was about 50 yards, and it was not changing. The figure was running at 60 miles per hour. The proportions were wrong. This is what registered in my mind, while the mirror showed me something that my experience could not explain and that my training did not cover. The proportions of the running figure were wrong. The legs were too long for the body. The stride was too wide. The legs were extending beyond the range that human legs extend in a full sprint, the knee driving forward, and the foot contacting the ground at a distance from the body that exceeded what the skeletal geometry of a human runner permits. The body was low, closer to the ground than a sprinting human would be. The torso angled forward at a degree that a running person cannot maintain because the center of gravity would pitch the body forward into a fall. The figure was running with a biomechanics that did not match human running. The joints were wrong, the proportions were wrong, the speed was wrong. I pushed to 65. The truck reached cruising speed. The figure kept pace for about a quarter mile at 65 miles per hour, and then the distance began to open. Slowly. The figure falling back from 50 yards to 75 to 100, the shape in the mirror shrinking incrementally as the truck's maintained speed finally exceeded whatever the figure was capable of sustaining. At about a quarter mile behind, the figure stopped. In the mirror, I could see the shape standing on the shoulder. The running ceased. The figure now stationary on the road behind me, the distance too great for details, LS. But the shape visible as a dark vertical line on the lighter surface of the shoulder, Standing where it had stopped, watching the truck pull away, I drove. I didn't slow down for 30 miles. I maintained 65, and I watched the mirrors, and the shape was gone within seconds of stopping, because 65 miles per hour adds distance at a rate that renders even a visible figure invisible within the time it takes to exhale. The road ahead was dark and empty. The road behind was dark and empty. The highway was the highway. The reservation was the reservation. The night was the night. I drove to Flagstaff, and I delivered the load, and I sat in the cab in the truck stop parking lot at 4:30 in the morning. G and I looked at my driver's side mirror, and the mirror showed the parking lot and the other trucks, and the lights of the truck stop, and nothing was running. I've driven that section of I-40 100 times since that night. The westbound run through the reservation between Gallup and Holbrook is the 100 miles of dark road that I cover twice a week on the overnight schedule. I pass mile marker 311 every westbound run. The shoulder is empty. The road is dark. The figure is not there. The highway at 2 in the morning is what it always is, empty and straight and vast and dark, and producing the isolation that the high desert produces when the nearest human being is miles away. But I don't slow down at mile marker 311 anymore. If there's a figure on the shoulder, I don't slow down. I don't assess. I don't evaluate. I maintain speed, D, and I pass, and I don't check the mirror until I'm a mile past, and the mirror shows nothing but the road behind and the dark, because I saw what the mirror showed me when I slowed down. I saw the figure running. I saw the proportions. I saw the speed. I saw a shape that was wearing dark clothing, and that raised a hand like a hitchhiker, and that ran at 60 miles per hour behind a loaded Kenworth on the shoulder of I-40 at 2 in the morning with legs that were too long and a stride that was too wide and a body that was too low and a speed that no living person produces on a desert highway in the dark. I've talked to other drivers, not about what I saw, about the route, about the reservation section, about mile marker 311. 2 of them got quiet. One of them said he'd seen something near there, a figure on the shoulder. At night, he said he didn't stop. He said the figure started running. He said he didn't want to talk about it. He said it with the particular, closed, final quality that a person produces when they've decided that the conversation is over and the subject is not something they're willing to discuss, and the memory is not something they're willing to revisit. He said one more thing. He said, don't slow down. He said, if you see someone on the shoulder between Gallup and Holbrook after midnight, don't slow down. He said, whatever it is, it can match 40. He said it can match 50. He said he didn't know what it could match if you gave it the chance to show you. He said, don't give it the chance. I work for the Bureau of Land Management as a range technician in the San Juan Basin of northwestern New Mexico. The basin is a geological formation that covers about 7,000 square miles of high desert country south of Farmington. The terrain, a mixture of badlands, mesa, and shallow canyon, and the particular, eroded, wind-sculpted landscape that the Cretaceous sediments produce, when 65 million years of exposure strips the surface to its fundamental geology and leaves behind the formations that the original deposition created. The basin is an oil and gas country, the subsurface containing the hydrocarbon deposits that the energy industry has been extracting since the 1950s, and that produces the network of well pads, D-access roads, and compressor stations that constitute the industrial footprint of energy development on federal land. My job is the biological side, the vegetation surveys, the range assessment, and the wildlife monitoring that the BLM conducts to ensure that the surface resources are being managed alongside the subsurface extraction, the particular dual mandate balance that federal land management requires when the same piece of ground is being used for energy production and for ecological preservation simultaneously. The work is solitary. Range technicians in the San Juan Basin work alone, driving to monitoring sites in agency trucks, conducting surveys that require days of fieldwork, in terrain that is remote enough that the nearest paved road might be 8 or 10 miles away, and the nearest town might be 30. The basin is not wilderness in the designated sense. It's a working landscape, the land showing the evidence of energy development, ranching, and the other uses that the federal management permits. But the remoteness is real. The distances are real. The isolation that the terrain produces when you're at a monitoring site 8 miles from the nearest road and the sun goes down and the darkness closes in is as complete as any isolation in the lower 48. The high desert at night, producing the particular, absolute, featureless dark that occurs when there are no trees to break the sky and no terrain features to provide reference, and no light sources except the stars and whatever you've brought with you. October of 2023. I was assigned to a 3-day vegetation survey at a monitoring site in the Central Basin, a GPS-located point about 8 miles from the nearest maintained road, accessible by a network of 2-track oil field roads that the energy companies maintain for their operations and that the BLM uses for access to monitoring sites. The site was on a flat, open expanse of desert between 2 shallow canyons, the terrain typical of the basin, the surface covered with the sparse vegetation that the surveys are designed to quantify, the greasewood and the saltbush, and the scattered bunch grasses that constitute the plant community in this part of the high desert. I arrived at the site on a Monday afternoon, drove the 2-track to the GPS point, and set up my camp, which consisted of my truck and the gear in the bed, and the understanding that I would be sleeping in the truck for 2 nights, because the site was too remote for daily commuting from Farmington, and the survey required 3 full days of field work. Sleeping in the truck is standard for remote basin work. The cab provides shelter and security. Why, and the elevation that sleeping on the ground in the desert does not. The truck's height places the occupant above the rattlesnakes, the scorpions, and the other ground-level hazards that the basin's ecology produces. The first day of field work was normal. The survey proceeded along the established transects, the methodology requiring me to walk predetermined lines across the site and record the vegetation at specified intervals. The data building a quantitative picture of the plant community that the BLM uses for range management decisions. The work is meticulous and slow and physically demanding in the way that walking across rough desert terrain for 8 hours is physically demanding. The distance covered modest, but the effort substantial because the ground is uneven and the vegetation is thorny, and the October sun, even at the diminished angle that autumn produces, is strong enough at 6,000 feet to dehydrate a person who isn't managing their water intake. I finished the first day's fieldwork at about 5 in the afternoon, returned to the truck, ate dinner from the cooler I'd packed, and settled into the cab to write my field notes. The field notes are the written record that accompanies the numerical data, the observations about soil conditions, weather, and wildlife signs, and the general ecological assessment that the range technician provides based on their professional judgments. I write the notes by headlamp because the truck's interior light drains the battery and because the headlamp provides directed illumination that is sufficient for the small notebook and the mechanical pencil that the notes require. It was about 10 at night. The field notes were nearly complete. The October night was cold, the temperature in the low 30s, the windshield showing the first crystallization of frost at the edges, the desert air dry and still and producing the particular, crystalline quality of cold that the high desert generates when the humidity is near zero and the sky is clear, and the heat that the day accumulated radiates back into space with the efficiency that cloudless skies provide. The truck was dark except for the headlamp. The windows were up, the doors were locked. The desert outside was the featureless dark of the basin at night, the terrain invisible, the sky enormous with stars, the nearest light source, the faint glow of a compressor station about 4 miles to the north, a tiny amber point on the horizon that represented the only evidence of human presence in any direction. The sound on the roof was not a thump. I want to be clear about this because the distinction matters. A thump would suggest an impact, a single contact of an object falling or being thrown, or the percussive sound that a rock or a branch produces when it strikes sheet metal. The sound was not that. The sound was a scrape. The sustained, continuous, weight-bearing sound of something with claws moving across the surface of the truck cab's roof, the claws producing the metallic, grinding friction that hard keratin produces on painted sheet metal when the claws are bearing weight, and the body they belong to is using them for traction. The scrape moved from back to front, from the area above the rear window toward the area above the windshield, slowly, with the deliberate pace of something that was not startled and not in a hurry, and that was moving across the roof with the unhurried purposefulness of an animal that was exactly where it wanted to be. The roof flexed. I felt it. The sheet metal of a truck cab is not thick. It's a layer of stamped steel that provides weather protection and structural contribution to the cab's rigidity, but that does not resist the weight of a large animal the way a structural beam resists weight. The roof flexed downward, a slight but perceptible bowing of the metal above my head, the deflection producing a subtle change in the headliner material that I could see from below, the fabric that covers the roof's interior showing the depression of something heavy pressing down from above. The weight was substantial, not a raccoon, not a small animal that had climbed the truck for warmth or curiosity, something heavy enough to flex the sheet metal of a modern truck cab, something that weighed, based on the degree of deflection that I was seeing, at least 60 or 70 pounds. I turned off the headlamp. Instinct. The instinct that says don't be visible when you don't know who's looking. The cab went dark. The stars provided the only light through the windshield, the faint, diffused, stellar illumination that allows the eyes to adjust and that produces the particular grayscale, shadow-free vision that dark-adapted eyes achieve after about 30 seconds without artificial light. I looked up through the windshield. Nothing on the hood. The windshield showed the sky and the stars and the desert beyond, and nothing on the hood of the truck that would indicate the source of the sound and the weight above me. I checked the mirrors. The side mirrors showed the flanks of the truck and the desert beyond, the dim starlight providing enough illumination to see that nothing was visible on the sides of the vehicle. Whatever was on the roof was staying on the roof, centered above the cab, moving forward with a slow scraping motion that I could hear and feel but not see because the animal was directly above me, and the truck's geometry prevented me from seeing anything that was on the roof from inside the cab. The scraping continued. Back to front. The weight shifted as the animal moved, the roof deflecting in a traveling wave that followed the sound, the depression in the headliner moving from the rear of the cab toward the front as the animal progressed. The sound was deliberate. The pace was slow. The animal was examining the truck from above, the claws contacting the metal with the exploratory, tactile quality of an animal that is using its feet to assess the surface it's on, the particular quality of movement that suggests curiosity rather than transit, investigation rather than passage. The scraping stopped at the front edge of the roof. The weight is concentrated above the windshield. The deflection in the headliner was at its maximum at the forward edge. The animal's weight positioned at the point where the roof meets the windshield frame, the spot from which something looking down would be looking directly at the windshield and at whatever was inside the cab behind the glass. The face appeared at the top of the windshield, upside down. The face descended from the roofline into the upper portion of the windshield, the animal extending its head over the edge of the roof and looking in at me from above. The face was inverted, the jaw at the top of my field of view, and the forehead at the bottom, the disorienting, wrong geometry of an upside-down face looking in through a windshield, from a position that placed the animal's head about 18 inches from the glass and about 2 feet from my own face. The face was canine. The shape was coyote. The muzzle was narrow and tapered, the ears pointed and erect even in the inverted position. The fur was the gray-brown, grizzled coloring that desert coyotes produce, the particular, sun-faded, dust-colored coat that San Juan Basin coyotes wear. The jaw was closed. The mouth showed no teeth. The face was not aggressive, not showing the snarl or the lip curl that canines produce when they're threatening. The face was looking, studying, examining me through the glass with an attention that was not the brief, reactive glance that a wild animal produces when it encounters a huma, but the sustained, evaluative, purposeful looking of something that wanted to see what was inside the truck, and that had climbed onto the roof and walked to the front edge and lowered its head over the windshield specifically to look. The eyes were wrong. This is the detail that I processed last, because the face and the position and the proximity and the sheer impossibility of what I was seeing consumed the first few seconds of cognitive processing, and the eyes required the additional processing time that anomalous details require when the context is already anomalous. The eyes were wrong. Coyote eyes are set on the sides of the skull, the lateral placement that prey animals and opportunistic predators share, the wide-angle visual field that provides peripheral awareness at the cost of binocular depth perception. The eyes in the face that were looking at me through my windshield were not set on the sides. The eyes were forward-facing, set in the front of the skull. The parallel, front-facing placement that predators use and that humans use, the binocular configuration that provides depth perception and focused attention, and the ability to direct both eyes at a single point with the concentrated, stereoscopic focus that forward-facing eyes produce. The eyes were looking at me, both eyes, directed at me, with the binocular focus that forward-facing placement provides. The face was coyote-shaped, but the eyes were human-placed, and the combination produced an expression that I can only describe as aware, not the blank reactive stimulus-response awareness of an animal encountering a novel object. The deeper awareness of something that was looking at me and seeing me and processing what it saw with the cognition that the face it was wearing was not designed to contain. 5 seconds. The face looked at me for about 5 seconds. I counted them the way I count anything in the field. The habitual, automatic mental ticking that fieldwork develops when precise observation is part of the job. 5 seconds of the upside-down face at the top of my windshield, the canine shape with the forward-facing eyes, The animal looking in at me from 18 inches away through a pane of glass that was the only barrier between whatever I was seeing and wherever I was sitting. The face withdrew, upward. The head pulls back over the edge of the roof with the controlled, smooth motion of a body retracting a limb. The face disappeared above the roof line, and the windshield showed only the stars and the desert and the frost beginning to form at the glass edges. I heard it drop from the roof. The sound was on the driver's side, the particular, heavy, muffled impact of a large body landing on desert ground from the height of a truck cab, about 6 feet. The landing was not four-footed. The sound was not the four-point impact that a quadruped produces when it jumps down from a height, the front feet hitting first and the rear feet following. The sound was two impacts, close together. The sound of 2 feet landing, the way a person lands when they jump from a height. 2 feet, hitting the ground at nearly the same time, is the bipedal landing that the bipedal anatomy produces. Then the walking. The footsteps are moving away from the truck on the driver's side. 2-footed, the rhythm unmistakable. Not the 4-beat pattern of a quadruped walking, the 2-beat pattern of a biped. Left, right, left, right. The footsteps on the hard desert ground, moving away from the truck, heading south, the sound diminishing with distance, the pace unhurried, the gait steady. The footsteps of something walking away on 2 legs across the desert at 10 at night with the particular, calm, unhurried quality of a departure that is voluntary and not driven by alarm. The footsteps faded. The desert was silent. The stars were above, and the frost was on the glass. And the truck was still. I was inside with the doors locked and the windows up and the headlamp off and the darkness complete. I didn't sleep. I sat in the cab with my hands on the steering wheel, and I stared at the windshield, and I waited for the dawn. The dawn came at about 6:30. The October sunrise slow and red on the eastern horizon, the light returning to the basin with a gradual, spreading illumination that the flat terrain produces when there are no mountains to block the light, and the sun clears the horizon, and the desert goes from dark to lit in the space of 20 minutes. I got out of the truck. I walked to the driver's side. The ground was hard-packed desert soil, the surface showing tracks with the clarity that dry, fine-grained soil provides when the surface is undisturbed and the tracking conditions are good. There were tracks beside the truck, canine tracks, the pad and claw impressions that coyotes leave, the four-toed, asymmetrical prints that any range technician in the basin can identify on sight. Because coyote tracks are the most common animal sign in the high desert. But the tracks were paired. 2 prints side by side, then 2 more, about 2.5 feet ahead, then 2 more. The paired, even spacing of bipedal locomotion, 2 feet walking side by side, stepping forward. The prints evenly spaced at the stride length of something walking upright. The tracks led south from the truck across the open desert, the paired prints extending in a straight line toward a shallow canyon about a quarter-mile south. The tracks maintaining the bipedal spacing for the entire visible distance, until the terrain dropped into the canyon and the tracks disappeared from my line of sight. On the roof of the truck, 4 scratch marks. Long, parallel grooves in the paint, running from back to front, the marks left by claws that were bearing weight and providing traction on the sheet metal surface. The grooves were deep enough to reach the primer beneath the paint. 4 claws, not 5. Canines have 4 toes on their front feet. The scratch pattern was consistent with canine claws. The behavior was not consistent with any behavior that wildlife biology recognizes. I completed the survey. I spent the remaining 2 days at the site, conducting the field work, collecting the data, and writing the notes. I slept in the truck both nights with the headlamp on, the doors locked, and the windows up. Nothing climbed on the roof. Nothing scratched the metal. Nothing looked in through the windshield with forward-facing eyes and a canine face. The remaining nights were the normal nights that the basin produces. Cold and dark and silent and vast and containing nothing that the range technician's training prepares him for and nothing that the field manual addresses. The scratch marks are still on the truck. 4 parallel grooves in the paint on the cab roof, running back to front. I haven't had them repaired. The fleet maintenance office asked about them during the last vehicle inspection. I said I scraped against a low branch. There are no branches in the San Juan Basin. The terrain is treeless for miles in every direction. The maintenance officer looked at the scratches, looked at me, and noted the damage and didn't ask again. The scratches are in the file as branch damage. The file does not record what actually made them because what actually made them does not have a category in the fleet, maintenance damage codes. Coyotes don't climb trucks. Coyotes don't look through windshields with forward-facing eyes. Coyotes don't walk away on 2 legs. Whatever was on the roof of my truck at a monitoring site in the San Juan Basin on an October night was shaped like a coyote and marked the roof like a coyote, and the eyes were not a coyote's eyes, and the walking was not a coyote's walking, and the face that looked at me through the glass for 5 seconds was wearing the features of an animal that it was not, and it knew I was inside, and it looked anyway, because it wanted to see, and it saw, and then it left, walking, on 2 legs, into the desert, into the dark, into whatever the basin contains at night when the range technicians are in their trucks, and the headlamps are off, and the stars are the only light, and the things that wear the wrong faces are between the GPS points, walking in the spaces that the surveys don't cover, in the dark that the fieldwork doesn't reach. My family has a sheep camp in the Chusca Mountains on the Navajo reservation, on the ridge that runs along the Arizona-New Mexico border in the northeastern part of the nation, the mountain range that rises from the high desert floor to about 9,000 feet, and that produces the meadows and the forests and the summer grazing that Navajo families have been using for their flocks since before the long walk and the return from Bosque Redondo and the reestablishment of the pastoral life that sheep represent in Navajo culture. The sheep are not just livestock. The sheep are identified. The sheep are the connection between the family and the land, and the traditional way of life that the sheep embody. The daily practice of herding, de-shearing, and lambing, and the seasonal migration between the lower winter pastures and the upper summer pastures that constitutes the oldest continuous agricultural practice on the reservation. The camp is at about 8,000 feet, in a meadow that sits in a saddle between 2 ridges, bordered on 3 sides by ponderosa pine and Douglas fir, and on the 4th by a slope that descends through spruce and aspen to an arroyo that carries snowmelt in the spring and rainwater in the monsoon, and that is dry by late summer, when the monsoon ends and the mountain begins its slow descent into the autumn that will drive the sheep back down to the lower pastures. The meadow is about 20 acres, the grass rich enough at 8,000 feet to sustain the flock for several weeks before the grazing pressure requires moving the sheep to the next meadow. The rotational pattern that my family has followed for at least 4 generations, the grandparents and the great-grandparents and the generations before them moving the flocks through these same meadows in the same seasonal rhythm that the grass and the snow and the rain dictate. The camp itself is modest. A trailer, the kind of small, older model travel trailer that reservation families use for seasonal camps, is towed to the site in the spring and left for the summer. The trailer providing shelter and cooking and the basic amenities that mountain sheep camps require. A corral for the sheep, constructed from juniper posts and wire, is the temporary enclosure that holds the flock at night when the predators are active, and the sheep need the protection that concentration provides. A fire ring, a water tank supplied by a spring about a 1/4 mile up the ridge. The water piped to the tank through a gravity-fed line that my uncle installed years ago, and that provides the reliable, cold, clear mountain water that the camp needs for people, D-dogs, and the sheep when the arroyo is dry. My uncle runs the camp. He's my mother's brother, a man in his late 50s who has been taking the sheep to the mountain every summer since he was old enough to help his father do it. The continuity of the practice maintained through the decades by a man who could have moved to Farmington or Gallup or Phoenix the way his siblings did, but who chose to stay and to keep the sheep and to maintain the traditional practice that the family's identity depends on. He's a quiet man, the kind of quiet that traditional Navajo men produce when they've spent their lives in the company of sheep and dogs and mountains, and the particular expansive silence that the high country maintains at 8,000 feet when the wind drops and the meadow is still, and the only sounds are the sheep and the birds and the creek and the enormous, layered, vertical silence of the forest. I was at the camp in August of 2022. I'm 26, living in Farmington, working at the Indian Health Service Hospital as a medical technician, the kind of modern, town-based, wage-earning life that the younger generation of Navajo families lives, while the older generation maintains the traditional practices on the land. I come to the camp for a week each summer to help my uncle move the flock between meadows, the labor-intensive process of gathering the sheep from the current meadow and driving them along the mountain trails to the next meadow, the work requiring more than one person, because the flock is about 200 head, and the trails are narrow and the terrain is steep, and the sheep, despite the millennia of domestication that their species has undergone, retain the particular, stubborn, herd panicking tendency to scatter at the worst possible moment on the most dangerous stretch of trail. We'd moved the flock that afternoon. A successful move, The sheep were driven about 3 miles along a ridge trail to a new meadow that my uncle had been resting since June, the grass tall and green and ready for the grazing pressure that 200 sheep would apply. The dogs had worked well. The 3 herding dogs that my uncle keeps at the camp year-round performing the flanking and the driving and the instinctive, bred-in stock management that herding dogs provide when they're experienced and well-trained and bonded to the flock. The move was complete by about 4 in the afternoon, and we'd return to the camp trailer to eat, rest, and prepare for the next day's work, which would be checking the flock in the new meadow and repairing the temporary corral that the new meadow's configuration required. We ate dinner. My uncle cooked on the propane stove in the trailer, the simple, hearty, high-calorie food that sheep camp work requires. Mutton stew, fry bread, and the strong coffee that my uncle drinks from morning to night at the camp, because the coffee is the fuel that the work runs on. We at we talked about the flock and the grazing and the weather and the other practical daily subjects that sheep camp conversation covers. The evening was warm. August at 8,000 feet produces evenings that are comfortable in a way that the lower desert never achieves. The temperature dropping from the daytime high of about 75 to the nighttime low of about 50, the air clear, and the sky showing the particular, deep, star-saturated quality that mountain skies produce when the atmosphere above is thin and dry and the light pollution is non-existent. We bedded down at about 9. The trailer has 2 bunks, narrow and basic, the sleeping arrangements of a seasonal camp where comfort is secondary to function. The dogs were outside. The 3 herding dogs lying in their usual positions around the trailer, the loose, relaxed, post-work posture that working dogs assume when the day's labor is completed, and the flock is settled. Ed and the dog's responsibility has shifted from active herding to passive watchfulness. The dogs sleep lightly at the camp. They're always listening. The particular, alert, half-sleep that herding dogs maintain at night is one of the camp security systems. The dogs responding to coyotes and bears and elk and any other presence that enters the perimeter of their awareness, with the appropriate level of vocalization. The low growl for a distant coyote, the sharp bark for a closer one, the full alarm bark for a bear or a mountain lion that approaches the flock. I was nearly asleep when the dogs started barking. The barking woke me fully in the way that alarm sounds wake you, the brain transitioning from the drowse of approaching sleep to full alertness in the time it takes for the sound to register and be identified as anomalous. The barking was wrong. Not the territorial, confident warning bark that the dogs produce for coyotes. Not the aggressive, deep-chested bark that bears receive. The barking was distressed, high-pitched, panicked. The particular, frantic, disorganized vocalization that dogs produce when they are afraid. The sound that a dog makes when the threat exceeds the dog's ability to categorize it, and the instinct says not fight and not flee but alarm. The vocal expression of a fear that the dog cannot resolve, because the source of the fear is something the dog's experience has not prepared it for. My uncle was awake. He was sitting up on his bunk, his boots already on. The preparedness of a man who sleeps lightly in the mountains and who responds to the dog's alarm the way a parent responds to a child's cry, immediately and without the intermediate step of full waking. He told me to stay in the trailer. He said it in Navajo, the language we use at the camp, the language that the camp's traditional context demands. He went to the trailer door, opened it about 6 inches, and looked out. The dogs were under the trailer, all 3 of them, pressed against the ground beneath the trailer's frame, their bodies flat, their tails tucked, the posture of maximum submission and fear. The dogs had retreated from their positions around the trailer to the space beneath it, the shelter of last resort that dogs seek when the threat above is too great for any other response. My uncle's dogs don't go under the trailer. In the years I've been coming to the camp, I've never seen them under the trailer. They face down coyotes. They stand their ground against bears. They do not retreat to the space beneath the trailer because the training and the breeding and the experience that herding dogs carry in their behavioral code does not include hiding. But they were hiding. All 3, under the trailer, pressed flat, the barking reduced to whimpers, the dog's confidence broken by something they could not identify and could not confront. My uncle closed the door to the 6-inch gap. He stood at the door, and he listened. I lay on the bun, and I listened. The meadow was quiet. The dogs were quiet, the whimpering subsiding into the pressed, silent, motionless terror of animals that have decided that silence is safer than sound. The forest was quiet. The particular, layered quiet of a mountain forest at Nig, when nothing is moving, and the air is still, and the only sound is the sound of the forest holding its breath. The voice came from the arroyo. About 100 yards downhill from the camp, the dry creek bed that carries water in the spring was empty in August. The voice was calling from the arroyo in the darkness below the camp. The voice was speaking Navajo. The voice was calling my uncle's name. The voice was his mother's, my grandmother, who had died 3 years earlier, who had been buried in the family cemetery near Lukachukai, who had been dead for 3 years, and whose voice was coming from the arroyo below the sheep camp at about 10 o'clock on an August night in the Chusca Mountains. The voice was perfect, not approximate, not a general resemblance that the darkness and the distance and the listener's desire to hear a familiar voice could have produced. Perfect. My grandmother's voice. The particular, slightly hoarse, warm, Navajo-accented voice that I had been listening to since infancy and that my uncle had been listening to since his birth, and that both of us recognize the way you recognize any voice that has been part of your daily life for decades. The pitch was right. The intonation was right. The particular way my grandmother pronounced my uncle's name, the emphasis on the second syllable, the slight rise at the end that Navajo names receive when they're being called across a distance, was right. The voice was my grandmother's voice, and it was calling my uncle's name from the dark arroyo below the camp. My uncle closed the door. He didn't slam it. He closed it with the controlled, deliberate motion of a man who is not panicking, but who is acting with a particular, focused urgency that the situation requires. He turned to me, and he said in Navajo, "Don't respond. Don't look. Don't acknowledge it in any way." He said it with the quiet, firm, absolute authority that my uncle brings to instructions that are not suggestions and that are not negotiable, and that come from the traditional knowledge that his mother and his grandmother and the generations before them placed in him for exactly this situation. The voice continued. From the arroyo, the voice called my uncle's name again and again. The voice was patient. The voice was not shouting. The volume was the volume of a person calling across 100 yards of mountain meadow, the projection that a voice produces when it wants to be heard at a distance without the urgency of a shout, the particular, carrying, almost conversational volume that my grandmother used when she called us in from the sheep pen or from the corral or from wherever we were on the property when dinner was ready. The voice moved. Over the next several minutes, the voice's position changed. It was no longer stationary in the arroyo. It was moving uphill, approaching the camp, the voice growing slightly louder as the distance decreased, the calling continuing with the patient, repetitive, unhurried rhythm of someone who is approaching while they call. The voice circled. It reached the level of theme Atawo, W, and it began to move around the camp in a circle, counterclockwise, the same direction my grandmother had described years earlier. The anti-sunwise circuit, the voice circling the camp the way the footsteps had circled my grandmother's hogan, the same counterclockwise direction, the same pattern. The voice knew things. This is the part that made the hair on my arms rise, and that produced the particular, visceral, physical fear that knowledge produces when the knowledge shouldn't be available to the entity that possesses it. The voice stopped calling my uncle's name and began speaking in sentences. In Navajo, the voice referenced my grandfather's death. It described the day of his funeral. It mentioned my uncle's daughter by name, the daughter who was in Farmington, and asked how she was doing. It referenced the sheep camp, specifically the meadow we'd moved the flock to that afternoon, saying the grass looked good up there, using the specific Navajo term for the meadow that the family uses, and that is not on any map. The voice knew the family's personal geography, the private vocabulary that 4 generations of sheep herding had produced for the specific meadows and trails and water sources on this mountain. The voice asked to come in. The voice said it was cold. The voice said it had been walking for a long time. The voice said it was tired and it wanted to rest. The requests were delivered in my grandmother's voice, with my grandmother's inflections and my grandmother's particular way of expressing need, the indirect, understated, culturally Navajo way of asking for something without demanding it. The voice performing the social conventions of a culture it was using to gain access. My uncle said nothing. He stood at the closed door with his hand on the frame. He reached into his pocket and removed a small pouch. He opened the pouch and took out a pinch of ash, the cedar ash that traditional Navajo people carry as spiritual protection, the ash from ceremonially burned cedar that carries the purifying properties that the Navajo practice assigns to the cedar tree. He sprinkled the ash across the bottom of the doorway, the threshold, the thin line of gray ash on the trailer floor, marking the boundary that the ash represents. The voice stopped. The cessation was abrupt, not the gradual fading of a voice moving away, but the instant silence of a voice that has been stopped, the sound cutting off mid-syllable the way a voice cuts off when something interrupts it. The voice was speaking, and then the voice was not speaking, and the silence that replaced it was the deep, enormous, mountain forest silence that the chuskas produce at night when nothing is moving, and the air is still. My uncle stood at the door for about 10 minutes. He didn't open it. He didn't look out. He stood with his hand on the frame, and he listened to the silence. Then he went back to his bunk, sat down, looked at me, and said in Navajo, "It's gone." He said it with a particular, exhausted, relieved quality of a man who has been holding a defense and who knows the defense is held and who can allow the tension that the defense required to begin dissipating. He said, "We're fine." He said, "The ash holds." He said, "It always holds." In the morning, we went outside. The dogs emerged from under the trailer, subdued and submissive. The 3 animals showing the residual behavioral effects of the previous night's fear. The dogs quieter than usual, staying closer to my uncle. The confident working dog demeanor temporarily diminished. The sheep were in the corral, undisturbed. The flock showing none of the agitation that coyotes or bears produce. Whatever had been at the camp had not approached the sheep. It had come for the trailer, for the people inside. The tracks were around the camp in a circle. I saw them in the morning light, the prints in the soft meadow soil. The prints were canine. The 4-toed, pad and claw impressions of a canine foot, larger than the herding dog's prints, the size suggesting an animal of about 70 or 80 pounds, a large coyote or a small wolf. But the spacing was wrong. The prints were paired, 2 prints side by side, then 2 more about 2.5 feet ahead. The paired, even spacing of bipedal locomotion, 2 feet walking side by side in the counterclockwise circle that the voice had traveled around the camp. My uncle looked at the tracks. He didn't comment, he didn't photograph them, he didn't point them out to me. He looked at them the way he looks at any sign on the land, with the evaluative, assessing attention of a man who reads the landscape for information and who processes the information without requiring discussion. He went to the firing ring, NG, and he built a fire. He burned cedar. He said a prayer. The smoke from the cedar rose into the morning air, and the prayer was in Navajo. Oh, and the prayer was the traditional one, the protection prayer, the one that addresses the forces that the tradition acknowledges and that asks for the continuation of safety that the night's defense had provided. We didn't discuss it. Not that day. Not during the remaining days of my stay. Not on the phone in the weeks that followed. The experience went into the space where such experiences live in Navajo families, the acknowledged but undiscussed category, the things that happened and that were real. And that the tradition provides context for, and that the tradition also provides instructions for managing. Don't respond. Don't look. Don't acknowledge. Sprinkle ash across the threshold. Burn cedar in the morning. Say the prayer. The instructions are specific because the threat is specific. And the instructions work because the tradition has been testing them against the threat for longer than anyone alive can remember. The voice was my grandmother's. I know my grandmother's voice. The voice from the arroyo was my grandmother's voice. But my grandmother is buried in the cemetery near Lukachukai, and my grandmother would not circle a sheep camp counterclockwise. And my grandmother would not ask to come in, because my grandmother would not need to ask. Whatever was in the arroyo had my grandmother's voice and my grandmother's knowledge and my grandmother's way of speaking. But it was not my grandmother. My uncle knew. The dogs knew. The ash knew. And the thing in the arroyo knew that my uncle knew. Because when the ash crossed the threshold, the voice stopped. Not because it chose to stop. Because the ash told it to stop. And it listened. Because ash is older than the thing in the arroyo. And the older things, on the mountain and in the tradition and in the world that my uncle maintains by taking the sheep up every summer and keeping the prayers and carrying the ashes, the older things still have authority, even at 10 o'clock on an August night, even in the dark. Even when the voice sounds like someone you loved, the ash holds. My uncle said it, the ash holds. It always holds. I live in Farmington, New Mexico, about 10 miles from the reservation border, in one of the housing developments on the south side of town that were built in the 1990s when the oil and gas industry was expanding in the San Juan Basin, and the border towns were growing with the families that the energy economy was pulling from the reservation and from the surrounding rural communities. My family moved to Farmington in 1994. My parents, both Navajo, had grown up on the reservation near Shiprock and had relocated to Farmington when my father took a job as a pipeline technician for one of the gas companies that operate in the basin, and my mother took a job at the school district, the particular, practical, Employment-driven migration that moved a generation of Navajo families from the reservation to the border towns, where the wages were higher and the infrastructure was better, and the trade-off was the distance from the traditional land and the traditional community that the reservation provided. I grew up in Farmington. I went to school in Farmington. I work in Farmington now, at a welding shop on the east side of town that services the oil and gas equipment that the basin's energy industry produces in constant, mechanical, never-ending volume. My brother, Marcus, works in the same industry, a different sector, the monitoring and maintenance side, the technicians who staff the compressor stations and the processing facilities that the natural gas infrastructure requires at regular intervals across the basin, the stations that compress the gas and move it through the pipelines and that operate continuously, 24 hours a day, the equipment running without pause and requiring human oversight at all hours, the night shifts staffed by single technicians who sit in the control rooms and watch the gauges and the screens, and wait for the alarms that indicate a malfunction that requires intervention. Marcus is 2 years younger than me, 26. We look alike in the way that brothers look alike, when they share the same parents and the same build and the same Navajo features, the black hair and the broad face and the brown skin and the particular, similar but not identical quality that siblings produce when the genetics are close, but the years are different. People know we're brothers. The resemblance is strong enough that strangers identify it without being told. The casual, "Oh, you must be Marcus's brother," that I've been hearing from people in Farmington my entire adult life. We're the same height, about 5 to 10, the same build, the stocky, wide-shouldered frame that our father has, and that his father had. The differences are in the details. My face is slightly narrower, Marcus's jaw is slightly wider. I have a scar above my right eyebrow from a fall when I was 12. Marcus doesn't, and I stand with my weight on my left hip. The particular, habitual, asymmetric posture that I've maintained since I tore the ligament in my right knee playing basketball in high school, and that the surgery didn't fully correct, and that has become, over the years, part of my physical identity. The way I stand when I'm not thinking about standing. The default posture that anyone who knows me recognizes as mine. January of 2023, a Thursday night. Marcus was working the overnight shift at a compressor station about 20 miles south of Farmington, one of the stations in the basin that the gas company operates, and that requires a technician on site from 6 in the evening to 6 in the morning, the 12-hour night shift that the station's continuous operation demands. I'd driven him to the station that evening because his truck was in the shop for a transmission issue. E and the station was close enough to Farmington that the drive was practical. L and the alternative, which was Marcus borrowing my truck for the night, was less convenient than the 40-minute round trip to drop him off and pick him up. I dropped him at the station at about 5:45 in the evening. The station is a fenced compound about 200 yards off the highway, the perimeter defined by a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire, the standard industrial security that oil and gas facilities maintain, the fence enclosing the compressor building and the control room and the piping and the equipment that the station contains. The gate has a code. Marcus entered the code and drove through and parked inside the fence and got out and waved, and I drove back to Farmington and went home and ate dinner and watched television and went to bed at about 11. My phone rang at 1:14 in the morning. Marcus. The screen showed his name and the time, and I answered with the particular, immediate, alarm-conditioned alertness that a phone call at 1 in the morning produces, the brain transitioning from sleep to full waking, in the time it takes to register that the phone is ringing, and that the caller is your brother, and that the hour is wrong for any call that isn't urgent. Marcus was speaking quietly, not whispering, speaking at the volume that a person uses when they don't want to be heard by someone nearby, but that isn't so low that the phone can't pick it up. He said there's someone outside the station. He said the person was standing at the perimeter fence about 50 yards from the control room building. He said the person was on the outside of the fence, standing on the desert ground beyond the chain link, facing the station. He said the person was watching the building. I asked him if he'd called the company's security line. He said no. He said he'd called me first. He said he'd called me because the person outside the fence looked like me. The sentence didn't register immediately. The words arrived, and the meaning followed at a delay. The particular cognitive lag that occurs when information is anomalous enough that the brain's initial processing rejects it, and the information has to be processed again before it's accepted. The person outside the fence looked like me. I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "The person is wearing your jacket." The jacket I'd been wearing when I dropped him off. A dark blue Carhartt, the insulated work jacket that I wear every day in the winter. The jacket that Marcus had seen me wearing 5 hours earlier when I'd driven him to the station. He said the person was wearing my jacket. He said the person was standing the way I stand, the weight on the left hip, the particular asymmetric knee-favoring posture that I've maintained since high school. He said the person was standing at the fence in the posture that I assume when I'm standing and not thinking about it, the default position that my body takes when the right knee is bearing less weight than the left. He said the person's posture was my posture. He said the person's face was my face. The shape, the features, the particular configuration that brothers recognize because they've been looking at a version of their own face in their sibling for their entire life. He said the face was my face, but he said the proportions were wrong. He said the eyes were too far apart. He said the distance between the eyes was wider than my face produces. The interpupillary distance slightly off, the eyes set a few millimeters too wide for the skull that was holding them. He said the mouth was too wide. The corners of the mouth extend farther than my mouth extends. The smile line, if the face were smiling, reaching farther toward the ears than my face's geometry allows. He said the skin had a quality that he struggled to describe and that he finally called loose. He said the skin of the face looked like it didn't quite fit the structure beneath it, the way a mask sits when the mask is close to the right size but not exact. The surface material draped over a frame that is similar, but not identical to the frame the surface was made for. I was in bed. I was in my house in Farmington, 10 miles from the reservation border, 20 miles from the compressor station where my brother was looking through the control room window at something that was wearing my face and standing in my posture and wearing my jacket on the other side of a chain link fence at 1 a.m. in the San Juan Basin. I told Marcus I was at home. I told him I was in bed. I told him I had not driven to the station, and I was not standing at the fence, and whatever he was looking at was not me. The silence on the line lasted about 3 seconds. The particular weighted silence of a person processing a confirmation that they already knew but that they needed to hear because the alternative, which is that the thing outside is actually your brother, is preferable to the truth, which is that the thing outside is not your brother and is something else wearing your brother's appearance. Marcus said the figure was still there, standing at the fence, looking at the building. My face, my jacket, my posture, the weight on the left hip. The figure had not moved since Marcus first noticed it about 10 minutes earlier. The stationary, watchful, patient stance of something that was not in a hurry, and that was content to stand and watch and wear a face that didn't quite fit. I told Marcus to stop looking at it. The words came from a place that I didn't consciously access, the deep, culturally embedded instruction that my parents had placed in both of us when we were young enough to absorb the traditional warnings without questioning them. Don't look at it. The same instruction that every Navajo family transmits to its children about certain things. The particular, firm, non-negotiable directive that looking at the thing gives the thing something it wants, and that the withdrawal of attention is the first and most important defense. I told Marcus to close the blinds and stop looking. He said, okay. I heard the sound of the blinds being closed through the phone, the metallic rattle of industrial window blinds being lowered in the control room. He said the blinds were closed. He said he couldn't see the fence anymore. I told him to keep the blinds closed until morning. I told him not to open the door. I told him to stay in the control room. Marcus stayed on the phone with me for about 40 minutes. We didn't talk about what was outside. We talked about other things. His truck, the transmission, the shop that was fixing it, the normal, mundane, grounding conversation that two brothers produce when one of them is in a control room with the blinds closed, and the other is in a bed 20 miles away. Why neither of them wants to talk about the thing that prompted the call. The conversation was the defense. The normal words filling the space that the abnormal situation had created. The brothers maintained the connection that the phone provided while the thing outside stood at the fence and watched a building whose windows were now blind. At about 2 a.m, Marcus said the motion sensor on the perimeter had triggered. The station security system includes motion-activated lights on the fence line and the industrial security lights that activate when something large enough crosses the sensor's detection zone. The lights had activated. Marcus didn't open the blinds to look. He told me the lights were on. About 30 seconds later, the lights went off. The sensor's timer expiring, the detection zone clear. Whatever had triggered the sensor had moved out of the zone. Marcus said the lights went off. I said, okay. We stayed on the phone for another 20 minutes. Then Marcus said he thought it was gone. He said the feeling was different. He said the particular quality of being watched, the sensation that the presence outside the fence had been producing, was gone. He said the air felt different. He said he was going to open the blinds. I told him not to. He opened them anyway. He said the fence line was empty. The desert beyond the fence was dark and still. The figure was gone. My face and my jacket and my posture were gone from the perimeter, and the station was alone in the basin the way it's alone every night. The equipment running, the gauges reading normal, the compressor station functioning in the middle of 20 miles of dark desert with no figure at the fence. I picked Marcus up at 6 in the morning. I drove to the station, and I entered the code, and I drove through the gate. E and Marcus came out of the control room and got in my truck, and he looked at my face, and I looked at his face, and neither of us said anything for about 5 miles. Then Marcus said it looked like you. He said it with the quiet, factual, undramatic delivery that our family uses for subjects that belong to the category of things that happen and that are real, and that the tradition provides context for, but that the modern world does not accommodate. He said it looked like you, but it wasn't right. He said the face was close, but not close enough. He said whoever made the face had most of the details right, but the spacing was off, and the fit was wrong, and the result was something that would fool a stranger but not a brother. I drove to the station the next night to pick up Marcus's shift report. The station was empty, Marcus having completed his shift and gotten a ride home with a coworker. I walked the perimeter inside the fence, looking at the ground outside the fence where Marcus said the figure had been standing. The ground was the hard-packed desert soil of the basin, the surface capable of showing tracks when the conditions are right. There were tracks outside the fence at the spot Marcus described. Boot prints. The tread pattern of the Red Wing work boots that I wear every day at the welding shop is the distinctive lug sole that Red Wing's work boot line produces and that I've been wearing for about 3 years. The boot prints were my size. The tread pattern was my boot's tread pattern. The stride length matched my stride, but I hadn't been there. I was in bed. My boots were at my front door, or where I leave them every night. The boots that made the tracks outside the fence were my boots, or something wearing the soles of my boots, as the thing at the fence was wearing my face and my jacket and my posture. The tracks led from the highway shoulder to the fence, and from the fence back to the highway. The tracks on the return showed a different gait. The paired boot print tracks transitioned about 50 yards from the fence into something else. The boot prints became canine prints. The transition was visible in the soil, the boot tread giving way to the four-toed pad and claw impressions of a large canine, the tracks changing from human to animal in the space of about 3 steps, the boot prints ending and the paw prints beginning and continuing to the highway, where they disappeared on the asphalt. I haven't told Marcus about the tracks. He doesn't need to know that the thing that wore my face also wore my boots, and that the boots became paws on the walk back to the highway. He knows enough. He knows it looked like me. He knows it wasn't me. He knows the proportions were wrong and the fit was loose, and the thing at the fence was wearing a version of his brother that was close enough to recognize and wrong enough to fear. He knows what it was. We both know. We grew up knowing. The word our parents taught us not to say. The thing that wears faces that don't quite fit. The thing that stands at fences at 1 in the morning wearing your brother's jacket and your brother's posture and your brother's face with the eyes too far apart and the mouth too wide and the skin loose over the bones like a mask that was made for someone else, and that is being worn by something that is not someone at all. I managed a trading post on the Navajo reservation near Tuba City, Arizona for about 5 years, from 2018 to 2023. The trading post is one of the old ones, established in the 1890s during the period when the federal government licensed Anglo traders to operate commercial outposts on the reservation. The licensed monopolies that provided goods and services to Navajo communities that were too remote and too dispersed for conventional retail, and that needed a centralized point of commerce where the families could buy flour and coffee and tools and fabric and the other staples of daily life that the traditional economy didn't produce, and that the cash economy, which arrived with the traders, made available in exchange for the wool and the rugs and the silver and the livestock that the Navajo families produced. The trading post system has been operating on the reservation for over 130 years. Most of the original posts are gone, replaced by convenience stores and gas stations and the modern retail infrastructure that the reservation's larger communities have developed. But some of the old posts survive. The stone buildings and the wooden counters and the particular anachronistic general store quality of a commercial establishment that serves as grocery and hardware store and post office and gathering place, and the social hub of a community that is measured in square miles rather than city blocks. The post I managed is one of these survivors, a stone building about 40 miles east of Tuba City on a road that serves a cluster of homes and hogans scattered across about 50 square miles of high desert, the families that the trading post has been serving since the building was constructed. The building was built in the 1920s by the trader who held the license at that time, a man named Henderson, whose name is still on the original sandstone cornerstone that is visible at the northeast corner of the building. Henderson built with the materials that the desert provided. The red sandstone that outcrops across the high desert of the Western Reservation, and that the original traders quarried and shaped and mortared into the thick-walled, flat-roof structures that became the standard trading post architecture. The walls are about 18 inches thick, the massive sandstone construction that provides insulation against the desert's temperature extremes. The interior stays cool in the summer and retains heat in the winter, with the thermal mass that stone provides when the walls are thick enough to absorb and release heat at a rate that moderates the interior climate without mechanical assistance. The roof is flat, the standard flat roof that the trading post architecture uses. The heavy timber beams spanning the stone walls and supporting the layers of lumber and tar paper and earth that constitute the roofing system. The flat surface that the desert climate allows, because the rainfall is minimal, and the snow load at 5,000 feet is light, and the drainage that sloped roofs provide is unnecessary in a landscape that receives about 8 inches of precipitation a year. The roof is accessible by a steel ladder bolted to the back wall of the building, the maintenance ladder that I use for roof inspections and for the periodic repair and resealing that the flat roof's tar paper surface requires. The ladder is the only way to reach the roof. The stone walls are about 12 feet high and smooth. The sandstone surfaces showing no handholds or footholds that would allow a person or an animal to climb from the ground to the roof without the ladder. I'm not Navajo. I'm Anglo, a woman from Flagstaff who took the trading post management position because the previous manager had retired, and the trading post's owner, a family that has held the license since the 1970s, he needed someone willing to live in the small apartment attached to the back of the building and to operate the post 6 days a week, and to manage the particular, complex, culturally sensitive business of serving a traditional Navajo community as an outsider. I'd worked in retail management in Flagstaff for about 10 years, and the trading post position offered something that Flagstaff retail didn't, which was the isolation and the quiet and the landscape and the particular, removed, deliberately different quality of life that managing a trading post on the reservation provides when you're willing to accept the remoteness and the solitude as features rather than drawbacks. The winter of 2021. December. I was on the roof doing a routine inspection after a period of high winds that had been moving across the desert for about 3 days. The dry, cold, relentless wind that the high desert produces in winter when the pressure systems shift, and the air mass that sits over the Colorado Plateau moves with a force that strips the sand from the surfaces and drives the tumbleweeds across the friend roads and produces the particular, sustained, wearing quality of wind that desert residents endure because the alternative is to live somewhere else. The wind had been strong enough that I was checking the roof for damage, the tar paper edges, and the seals around the vents, and the drains that the flat roof requires for the minimal rainfall that it receives. The tracks were near the center of the roof. Canine tracks. The four-toed pad and claw impressions that canine feet produce in the thin layer of sand and dust that accumulates on the flat roof surface between cleanings. The tracks were large, significantly larger than the tracks of the dogs that the local families keep, the reservation dogs that range freely through the area and that occasionally approach the trading post for the scraps that accumulate around the dumpster at the back of the building. The tracks were larger than coyote tracks, which I'd seen on the ground around the building many times, the coyotes being the most common predator in the area and the most frequent visitor to the trading post's perimeter. The tracks on the roof were bigger. The pad width was about 3 inches, the overall print about 4 inches from the rear pad to the front claw tips, the size suggesting an animal of at least 80 or 90 pounds, larger than any dog or coyote I'd seen in the 5 years I'd been at the post. The tracks formed a pattern, a circuit. The tracks circled the roof in a path that followed the perimeter about 3 feet from the edge, the circuit showing the animal walking a consistent, measured circle around the roof's surface, the spacing between prints even and the direction consistent. The animal walking the perimeter the way a person paces when they're watching something below, the circuit maintaining the 3-foot distance from the edge that allowed the animal to look over the edge at the ground without stepping too close to the drop. The tracks completed 2 full circuits and then deviated. From the circling path, the tracks crossed to the front of the building and approached the edge directly above the front entrance, the stone lintel above the door that is the trading post's main public entrance. The tracks stopped at the edge. The last prints were positioned with the front toes at the very lip of the roof, the animal standing at the edge and looking down at the door 12 feet below, the position that a person assumes when they're looking over the edge of a roof at something on the ground, the toes at the edge and the body weight shifted forward and the attention directed downward. I checked the ladder. The steel rung showed no marks. No scratches, no mud, no hair, no evidence that an animal had climbed the ladder's rungs with claws that would have left scratches on the painted steel surface. The ladder was clean. The walls were clean. The smooth sandstone surfaces showed no claw marks, no scratches, no disturbance to the dust and the sand that accumulates on the stone's horizontal surfaces. Whatever had made the tracks on the roof had not climbed the ladder and had not climbed the 12-foot stone walls. I swept the roof. I cleared the tracks. I noted the date in the maintenance log that I keep for the building, the factual record of conditions and repairs that the owner requires. I wrote animal tracks on the roof, of unknown origin, and I moved on with the day's work because the trading post opens at 8, and the customers arrive on their own schedules, and the business doesn't pause for tracks on the roof that I can't explain. The tracks appeared again 4 days later. I checked the roof on a Saturday morning. G and the prints were there. The same large canine tracks, the same circling pattern, the same deviation to the front edge above the door, the same stopping position with the toes at the lip. The pattern was identical to the first occurrence, the circuit, S, and the approach to the edge, E, and the standing position above the door. The ladder was clean. The walls were clean. The animal had reached the roof by a method that the building's physical structure did not provide for. The pattern repeated through December and into January. Every 3 or 4 days, I would find fresh tracks on the roof. The timing was overnight, the tracks appearing between my evening roof check and my morning inspection, the tracks made during the dark hours when the trading post was closed, and I was in the apartment at the back of the building, G asleep. The pattern was always the same. 2 circuits, the approach to the front edge, the standing position above the door, the tracks fresh and clear in the dust that accumulated between visits. The ladder untouched. The walls untouched. In January, I set up a camera. A trail camera. The kind that wildlife researchers and hunters use. The motion-activated camera that I mounted on a pole at the back of the building, pointed at the roof line. The camera positioned to capture anything that approached the roof from the back, where the ladder was. The camera ran for 2 weeks. It captured coyotes at the dumpster. It captured rabbits. It captured the neighborhood dogs on their rounds. It did not capture anything, climbing the ladder, climbing the walls, or reaching the roof by any means. And during those 2 weeks, the tracks appeared on the roof 3 times. The camera was pointed at the back of the building, the ladder, the walls, the ground approach from the rear. Whatever was reaching the roof was not coming from the back. I moved the camera to the front, pointed at the front wall and the roof line above the entrance. The camera ran for another 2 weeks. It captured nothing approaching the roof from the front. The tracks appeared twice during those 2 weeks. The camera at the front showed the front wall, the road, D, and the parking area, and nothing reached the roof from any direction that the camera covered. The thing was reaching the roof without approaching the building from any direction that a ground-level camera could capture. The thing was on the roof without having traveled across the ground to get there. The thing was appearing on a 12-foot-high flat surface without climbing, jumping, or any physical pathway that connected the ground to the roof. Harold Begay changed how I thought about the tracks. Harold was an elder from one of the families that the trading post served, a man in his mid-70s who came to the post every Tuesday to buy coffee and flour and to collect his mail and to sit in the chair by the stove and talk with whoever was there. The social function of the trading post, that has nothing to do with commerce and everything to do with the human need for gathering that isolated communities maintain through the institutions that bring them together. Harold had been coming to the post for longer than I'd been managing it. He knew the building, he knew the area, he knew the particular, deep, traditional knowledge that Navajo elders carry about the landscape and the forces that inhabit it. I mentioned the tracks to Harold on a Tuesday in late January. I mentioned them casually, the way you mention a maintenance issue, without the weight that I'd been carrying privately for 6 weeks. I said I'd been finding large animal tracks on the roof, and I couldn't figure out how the animal was getting up there. Harold set down his coffee. He looked at me. He got up from the chair, walked to the back of the building, and climbed the ladder. He was 75, and he climbed the steel rungs with the agility that a lifetime of physical work on the reservation produces. He looked at the roof. The latest tracks were there from the previous night. He looked at the tracks. He looked at the circling pattern. He looked at the path to the front edge and the standing position above the door. He climbed down. He looked at me. He said one word, in Navajo, a word that I had heard before in the 5 years I'd been on the reservation. A word that the community used in certain contexts with certain inflections, and that I had learned to recognize without fully understanding, because the word belongs to a category of knowledge that the culture shares with outsiders, reluctantly and incompletely. The word refers to a specific kind of entity. Harold said the word D, and then he left. He walked to his truck, K, and he drove away. He did not come back to the trading post for a month. When Harold returned in late February, he didn't mention the tracks. He didn't mention the word he'd said. He brought me something. A small bundle of dried herbs tied with a string, the bundle showing the particular construction that traditional Navajo medicine uses for protective purposes. He told me to hang it above the front door, inside, above the lintel where the customers wouldn't notice it. He said to hang it and to leave it and not to touch it. He said the bundle would need to be replaced every 6 months and that he would bring a new one when the time came. I hung the bundle. I hung it above the front door on a nail that I drove into the wooden lintel, the bundle hanging inside the building directly below the spot on the roof where the tracks stopped, the edge where whatever was making the tracks stood, and looked down at the door every 3 or 4 nights. The tracks continued for about 2 more weeks after I hung the bundle. Then they stopped. I checked the roof every morning through March and April, L and May and into the summer. R and the roof was clean. The dust accumulated undisturbed. No tracks. No circuits, no standing position above the door. Whatever had been climbing to the roof without climbing and circling in the night and looking down at the entrance had stopped coming. Harold came in June with a new bundle. He took down the old one and gave me the new one, and I hung it on the same nail above the door. He didn't explain what the bundle contained or what it did or why it worked. He said it's good now. He said it in the particular, quiet, conclusive way that Navajo elders say things when the subject is closed, and the explanation is not necessary because the result is sufficient. The tracks are gone. The bundle is above the door. The connection between those two facts is the explanation. I left the trading post in 2023. The new manager, a young Navajo woman from Kayenta, took over in the spring. I told her about the bundle above the door. I told her Harold would come every 6 months with a new one. I didn't tell her about the tracks, because telling her about the tracks would require explaining what made them, and I don't have the explanation. Harold has the explanation. The word he said, the bundle he brought, and the traditional knowledge that connects the two are Harold's to share or withhold, and Harold chose to share only the solution, not the problem. But I remember the tracks. The large canine prints circling the roof in the night, the approach to the edge above the door, the standing position with the toes at the lip, the thing looking down at the entrance of the trading post from 12 feet above, looking at the door that the community passes through every day, to buy their coffee and their flour and to collect their mail and to sit by the stove and talk. The thing on the roof is watching the door, night after night, for weeks, looking down at the entrance of a building that he could not enter because the entrance is a door, and doors in Navajo tradition are thresholds, and thresholds have protections, and the protections, once Harold placed them, were sufficient. The bundle above the door, the dried herbs that I never identified, the string that held them, the nail in the lintel. The protection is older than whatever was on the roof, because whatever was on the roof stopped coming when the bundle went up, and the bundle is still there, and Harold still comes every 6 months, and the roof, as far as I know, is clean. The dust is undisturbed, the tracks are gone. The thing that was watching the door is no longer watching, because the door is protected now, and the protection, Harold said, is good. My husband and I were driving from Gallup to Shiprock on Highway 491 inches November of 2022, a drive we make about twice a month, because my husband's mother lives in Shiprock, and the distance between Gallup and Shiprock is about 90 miles, and the highway that connects them is the road that used to be Route 666 before. The state of New Mexico renumbered it in 2003. Because the association with the number of the beast was producing a reputation that the highway didn't need, a reputation that had grown over decades from the combination of the number and the death rate and the stories that the Navajo communities along the route had been telling about the road for as long as the road had been there, stories that preceded the numbering and that the numbering simply gave a convenient, culturally resonant label to. The highway is dangerous. This is not superstition. This is statistics. Highway 491 is a 2-lane road that crosses about 100 miles of reservation land between Gallup and Shiprock, the road cutting through high desert terrain that is flat and open and straight, and that produces the particular lethal combination of high speed, low visibility, and isolation that makes the road one of the most dangerous in the country by any actuarial measure. The speed limit is 65. The traffic moves at 70 or 75. The road is straight enough that drivers accelerate beyond what the conditions warrant, and dark enough after sunset that the visibility shrinks to the reach of the headlights, and the reaction time at 70 miles per hour is insufficient. For the obstacles that the road presents, the livestock that wander onto the pavement, and the pedestrians who walk the shoulder, and the drunk drivers who cross the center line, and the particular, desert-specific hazard of the road surface, disappearing in the darkness when the terrain on both sides is the same elevation and the same color as the road. And the only way to tell where the road is and where the desert is the headlights and the painted lines and the particular, attentive, sustained concentration that night, driving on 491 demands. We left Gallup at about 8:30 in the evening. The drive to Shiprock takes about 90 minutes at the speed limit. The route heading north from Gallup through the reservation. The road passing through the small communities of Yatahay and Newcomb, and the scattered homes and chapter houses that the reservation's dispersed population maintains along the highway corridor. The November night was cold, about 25 degrees, the high desert temperature that November produces at 6,000 feet when the sun is down and the sky was clear, and the heat that the desert accumulated during the day has radiated back into space with the efficiency that dry air and cloudless skies provide. The sky was enormous. The stars were the dense, bright, overwhelming canopy that the reservation sky produces when the light pollution is zero, and the atmosphere is thin and dry. And every star that the eye can resolve is visible in a dome that extends from horizon to horizon without interruption. My husband was driving. I was in the passenger seat. The truck was a 2019 Chevy Silverado, the standard pickup that the reservation's roads and distances and terrain require, the vehicle that every family in the Four Corners region owns, because the alternative is to not go anywhere when the roads are bad, and the weather is worse. The headlights were on high beam, the standard configuration for 491 at night, the high beams reaching about 300 feet ahead, the cone of visibility that the headlights provide in the flat, featureless, shoulderless terrain that the highway crosses. The road was empty. After the last community, about 30 miles north of Gallup, the traffic had thinned to nothing. The particular, complete emptiness that 491 produces after 9 at night. When the commuters are home and the trucks are at the truck stops, and the road becomes a strip of asphalt in the desert with nothing on it and nothing beside it, and the headlights reaching ahead into a darkness that the headlights, defined by being the only light in it. We'd seen one vehicle in the last 20 minutes, a southbound truck whose headlights appeared as a distant point and grew and passed and shrank and disappeared behind us. The encounter lasting about 30 seconds, and the road returning to its empty state as if the truck had never existed. Mile marker Oteo Haltreds. About 45 miles north of Gallup, about 45 miles south of Shiprock, the midpoint of the drive, the section of road that is equidistant from the two towns, and that is therefore the most isolated, to the point where the nearest help in any direction is 45 miles away, and the nearest light source is the headlights, and the nearest human beings are the driver and the passenger and whoever else might be on this stretch of highway at 9:30 on a November night. My husband said there's something on the road. I looked ahead through the windshield. The headlights were reaching into the darkness, the beams illuminating the asphalt and the painted center line and the desert on both sides with the particular, flat, white-blue quality that modern LED headlights produce, the light reaching about 300 feet and then fading into the dark that the headlights cannot reach. At the edge of the headlight range, on the right side of the road, on the shoulder or just beyond it, there was a shape. The shape was dark. This is the first thing I registered, the darkness of the shape, and the registration produced a cognitive conflict because the headlights were reaching the shape, and the shape should have been illuminated. The headlights illuminate everything they reach. Every object within the headlight cone reflects some portion of the light to the observer, the reflected photons providing the visual information that allows the driver to see the road, see the obstacles, and the terrain. A coyote on the shoulder reflects light. A fence post reflects light. A person in dark clothing reflects light. Every physical object that exists in the material world reflects light because the physics of optics requires it. The photons striking the surface and bouncing back at angles determined by the surface's texture, decolor, and composition. The shape was not reflecting the headlights. The light reached the shape. E and the light did not come back. The shape was dark. K, the way a hole is dark, the way an absence is dark, the surface absorbing the headlight beam without returning the photons to my eyes. The headlights were reaching the shape. I could see the beams extending to the position where the shape was standing, the light illuminating the road surface and the desert ground around the shape. But the shape itself was not being illuminated. The light stopped at the surface of the shape, in the way light stops at the edge of a shadow, except this was not a shadow, because a shadow is the absence of light blocked by an object. T, and this was an object that was present, and that was absorbing the light that reached it. The shape was tall. This was the second registration, after the darkness. The shape was taller than a person, significantly taller. The shape extended above the height that a person standing on the shoulder of the road would produce in the headlights. The top of the shape at a height that I estimated at 8 feet. The proportions suggesting something that was standing upright, and that was roughly humanoid in general outline. The vertical, bipedal configuration of a body standing on 2 legs, but at a height and a width that exceeded human proportions. We were approaching the shape at 60 miles per hour. The closing distance was about 5 seconds from the moment my husband said there's something on the road to the moment we passed it. 5 seconds of the shape growing larger in the windshield as we approached. The headlights reaching it and failing to illuminate it. The dark form getting bigger without getting clearer. The details remaining invisible because the light that would reveal the details was being absorbed by the surface rather than reflected. My husband didn't slow down. The instinct that 491 develops in people who drive it regularly. The particular, do not stop, do not slow down, keep moving response that the road's reputation and the road's reality produce in the drivers who have internalized the understanding that stopping on 491 at night is more dangerous than anything you might stop. 4. He maintained speed. 60 miles per hour. The shape passed on my side, the passenger side, the right side of the road, where the shape was standing. The shape was about 10 feet from the edge of the travel lane, close enough that as we passed, the headlights were at their maximum lateral angle to the shape, the light hitting the surface from the side rather than from the front. The shape did not illuminate from the side. The headlight beam passed across the shape as we moved past it, and the shape remained dark, the surface absorbing the lateral light the way it had absorbed the frontal light, the shape maintaining its particular, absolute, light-consuming darkness from every angle that the headlights provided as we drove past. Then we were past. The shape was behind us. I turned in my seat and looked through the rear window. The taillights of the Silverado are LED, the modern bright red-emitting lights that pickup trucks use, the lights casting a red glow on the road surface behind the vehicle, the glow reaching about 50 feet behind the truck and illuminating the road, the shoulders, and whatever is within the taillights' range. The taillights illuminated the shape. The red light reached the shape and reflected. The shape that had absorbed the white headlight beam and returned nothing was reflecting the red taillight and returning the light to my eyes with the normal, expected, physics-compliant behavior that reflective surfaces produce. The shape was visible in the red taillight, glow in a way that it had not been visible in the white headlight beam. Not fully visible, not detailed or clear, but visible. The red light was reflecting off the surface and showing me the general outline of the shape, the tall, upright, vertical form, the proportions that suggested something standing on 2 legs at a height of about 8 feet, the dark surface now showing a faint, red illuminated texture that the white light had not revealed. The eyes. The shape had eyes. In the red taillight glow, 2 points of reflected light appeared at the top of the shape, at approximately 8 feet above the ground. The particular, intense, bright reflection that animal eyes produce when light hits the tapetum lucidum, the reflective layer behind the retina that nocturnal animals possess, and that produces the eyeshine that hunters and drivers see when their lights hit the eyes of deer and coyotes and cats and the other animals whose vision is adapted for. Darkness. The eyeshine was bright, intense. The particular, luminous, almost self-generating quality that tapetum reflection produces when the light source is strong and the angle is right. T and the eyes are large enough to capture and return a significant volume of light. The eyes were reflecting the red tail light, not the white headlight. The headlights had reached the shape from the front. T and the eyes had not produced eyeshine. The taillights were reaching the shape from behind, and the eyes were producing the bright, animal-reflective, tapetum-generated eyeshine that the headlights had not triggered. The shape reflected red light and absorbed white light. The physics of this distinction is not something I can explain. The optics of normal, material world surfaces do not produce selective reflection based on the wavelength of the light. A surface that reflects red light should reflect white light because white light contains red light among its component wavelengths. A surface that absorbs white light should absorb the red component of white light and should therefore absorb red light when it's presented as a separate wavelength. The shape was doing something that the physics of reflection does not account for. The shape was absorbing the full spectrum and reflecting only the red, the selective, wavelength-specific behavior of a surface that is not behaving the way surfaces behave. The eyes were at 8 feet. 8 feet above the road surface. The eye shine at 8 feet placed the eyes at the top of the shape, the position that eyes occupy on a head that is at the top of a body that is standing upright. The body was 8 feet tall and standing on the shoulder of Highway 491 at 9:30 on a November night. T and reflecting taillight red, from eyes that had not reflected headlight white and absorbing the headlight beam. The way a hole absorbs light, the photons entering and not returning. We passed. The shape receded in the rear window. The eye shine dimmed as the distance increased. D and the taillight glow faded, and the shape returned to the darkness that it had been part of before the headlights reached it, and that it returned to after the taillights left it. The shape was gone. The road behind was dark. The rear window showed nothing but the highway stretching back into the desert, and the darkness closing behind us the way darkness always closes behind a vehicle on 491 at night. My husband drove. He didn't speak for about 5 miles. His hands were at 10 and 2. His speed was 60. His eyes were on the road ahead. When he spoke, he said, "What was that?" I said, "I don't know." He said the headlights didn't reach it. I said, "I know." He said the taillights did. I said, "I know." He said the eyes were too high. I said, "I know." The conversation was the conversation of two people confirming that they saw the same thing, and that the thing they saw was not something that the rational framework accommodates, and that the confirmation of shared perception is the only comfort available when the perception itself is incomprehensible. We drove to Shiprock. We arrived at his mother's house at about 10:15. We went inside. My husband's mother, a Navajo woman in her 70s who has lived in Shiprock her entire life and who has been driving and riding on 491 since the road was built, looked at us when we walked in. She looked at our faces, and she said, "What happened?" My husband told her. He described the shape, the darkness. The headlights didn't illuminate it. The taillights that did. The eyes at 8 feet. His mother listened. She didn't ask questions. She didn't express surprise. She didn't offer the skepticism or the reassurance that the story might have received from someone who hadn't spent 70 years living beside the highway and hearing the stories that the highway produces. She said you weren't supposed to look back. She said it to me because I was the one who had turned in the seat and looked through the rear window and seen the eyes. She said when you pass something on that road, you don't look back. She said looking back is how it knows you saw it. She said looking back is the invitation. She said the headlights didn't reach it because it didn't want to be seen from the front. She said the taillights reached it because you looked back, and the looking back changed the rules. She said to burn cedar before we drove home. She said the cedar would be sufficient. She said the thing on the road was old and the road was new, and the thing had been in the desert before the road was built, and the road had been built through its territory, and the thing stands on the shoulder because the shoulder is the edge of the road, and the edge of the road is the boundary between the human infrastructure and the desert, and the thing stands on the boundary because the boundary is where it lives. Between the road and the desert, between the human and the other, between the light that reaches and the dark that doesn't yield. We burned cedar. We drove home the next afternoon in daylight. We passed mile marker 58. The shoulder was empty. The desert was flat and open, and the November sun was low, and the road was just a road. The asphalt strip that connects Gallup and Shiprock through 100 miles of high desert that is well lit and featureless, and revealing nothing in the daylight that the darkness concealed. I've driven 491 at night since. The shape has not appeared. The headlights reach the road, and the shoulders and the desert and everything reflect the way everything should. But I don't look back. When we pass something on the shoulder that I can't identify, when the headlights reach a shape that doesn't quite resolve, when the darkness at the edge of the beam seems denser than the darkness should be, I don't turn in the seat and look through the rear window. I face forward. I let the shape pass behind us. I let the taillights reach whatever they reach without my eyes confirming what the taillights show, because my mother-in-law said looking back is the invitation. And the invitation, once extended, changes the rules. And the rules, once changed, allow the thing at the edge of the headlight beam to know that you saw it. And once it knows you saw it, it knows where you are. And the next time you drive through its territory on the road that was built through the desert, where it was standing before the road existed, you'll be standing there again, at the edge of the beam, at 8 feet tall, with eyes that reflect the red and absorb the white, waiting for you to look back, because you looked back once, and the looking back was the invitation, and the invitation on Highway 491 is not something you can take back. My cousin is a Hata Ali, a medicine man, a practitioner of the traditional Navajo healing ceremonies that have been performed on the reservation for centuries, and that constitute one of the most complex and one of the most carefully preserved systems of spiritual medicine in the indigenous world. The training to become a Hatale takes years. My cousin began his training in his early 20s under the instruction of his maternal grandfather, who was himself a Hata Ali and who had been performing ceremonies in the eastern part of the reservation for over 40 years. The training is apprenticeship-based, the knowledge transmitted from teacher to student through observation and practice, and the memorization of the chant, the prayers, the sand paintings, and the specific, precise, sequenced elements that each ceremony requires. My cousin completed his training after about 8 years and has been performing ceremonies independently for about 12 years, serving the communities in the eastern part of the reservation, the area around Crown Point and Standing Rock, and the scattered communities that occupy the high desert country between the Chusca Mountains and the Rio Puerco. I'm not a Hatali. I'm his cousin, a woman who works as a nurse at the Indian Health Service Hospital in Gallup, the Western medicine side of the healthcare system that serves the Navajo Nation, the institutional counterpart to the traditional medicine that my cousin practices. We work in the same field from different directions. My cousin addresses the spiritual and the ceremonial dimensions of illness and imbalance, and my work addresses the biological and the clinical dimensions. The two systems coexist on the reservation the way they've coexisted for over a century, the patients moving between the IHS hospital and the Hatali as their conditions require, the Western medicine treating the body, and the traditional medicine treating the spirit, and the patient receiving both. Because both are necessary, and because the tradition teaches that illness has dimensions that the hospital cannot reach, and that the ceremony addresses. My cousin doesn't discuss the specifics of his ceremonies with me. This is not a personal boundary. It's a professional one. The details of what occurs during a ceremony are sacred. The chants, the prayers, the sand paintings, and the specific sequence of events that constitute a ceremony are not public information and are not shared outside the ceremonial context. The Hata Ali protects the ceremony's integrity by maintaining its privacy, the same way any professional protects the confidentiality that their work requires. My cousin tells me general information. He tells me where he's been called. He tells me the nature of the problem in broad terms. He tells me the outcome. He does not tell me the details. In the spring of 2023, my cousin was called to perform a ceremony for a family near Crown Point, New Mexico. Crown Point is a small community in the eastern part of the reservation, about 60 miles northeast of Gallup, a community of maybe 3,000 people in the high desert country, where the reservation extends into the San Juan Basin. The community is remote in the way that most reservation communities are remote, the nearest full-service town being Gallup, and the distance being an hour on roads that are partially paved and partially dirt. And the weather makes it impassable with a regularity that the families have been accommodating since before the roads existed. The family that called my cousin was a family of 5. A mother, a father, 3 children. The father worked at a mine near Crown Point. The mother worked at the school. The children ranged in age from 6 to 14. They lived in a house about 4 miles from the center of Crown Point, a HUD house, one of the government-built homes that the federal housing programs have been placing on the reservation since the 1960s. The prefabricated, single-story, flat-roofed structures that constitute a significant portion of the reservation's housing stock. The house had a skylight, a feature that some of the HUD houses include, a square of glass in the flat roof that provides natural light to the interior. My cousin told me the family had been experiencing disturbances for about 2 months before they called him. The disturbances had started small, sounds at night, scratching on the exterior walls. The dogs are behaving abnormally. The family's 2 dogs retreating under the porch at night and refusing to come out until morning. The dogs showing the particular, submissive, fear-driven behavior that dogs on the reservation display when they encounter something that exceeds their ability to categorize and respond to. The scratching was on the walls, moving around the house, the sound traveling in a counterclockwise circle, the direction that my cousin identified immediately as significant because the counterclockwise circuit is the signature. The directional fingerprint that identifies the nature of the disturbance without requiring further evidence. The disturbances escalated. The sounds progressed from scratching to knocking. The knocking progressed to voices. The voices spoke in Navajo. The voices used the names of dead relatives, the personal Navajo names that only family members know. The voices asked to come in. The voices referenced specific family events, details that only the family would know, the particular, private, intimate knowledge that the entity was deploying to establish familiarity and to create the conditions for entry. The pattern was consistent with what my cousin's training had prepared him for. the escalating sequence that the tradition describes and that the ceremonies are designed to address. Then the physical evidence. The family found tracks around the house in the morning. Canine tracks. Large. The four-toed pad and claw impressions of a canine foot, but the spacing was bipedal. 2 prints side by side, then 2 more about 2.5 feet ahead. The counterclockwise circuit visible in the tracks. The path around the house shows the same counterclockwise direction that the sounds had been traveling. And the roof. The father, who climbed a ladder to inspect the roof after hearing sounds from above, found tracks on the flat surface of the Hud house roof. The same canine tracks, the same bipedal spacing, the tracks circling the skylight. The family saw it. The 14-year-old daughter woke in the night and looked up through the skylight and saw a shape crouching at the edge of the glass, looking down into the house. The shape was dark. The shape was the approximate size and proportion of a person in a crouched position. The shape was looking through the skylight at the family sleeping below. The daughter screamed. The shape withdrew from the skylight. The father went outside with a flashlight. The roof was empty. The ladder was against the back wall where he kept it. The ladder showed no marks. They called my cousin the next day. My cousin drove from his home near Standing Rock to Crown Point, about an hour's drive. He met with the family. He assessed the situation. He determined that a ceremony was required, a specific ceremony from the traditional repertoire, one of the protection ceremonies that the Navajo healing tradition provides for situations where the disturbance is being produced by the particular kind of entity that the counterclockwise circuit and the voice mimicry and the canine bipedal tracks indicate. The ceremony was 4 days long. This is standard for the type of ceremony my cousin determined was necessary, the 4-day duration reflecting the significance of the 4 cardinal directions and the 4 sacred mountains and the 4 base numerology that Navajo ceremonial practice uses as its structural framework. My cousin set up the ceremony at the family's home. He prepared the ceremonial space. He began the chants. He created the sand paintings. He performed each element of the ceremony in the precise, correct, sequenced order that his grandfather had taught him and that his grandfather's grandfather had taught before that. The chain of transmission that extends back through the generations to the origin of the ceremony itself. The first 2 nights of the ceremony were uneventful. The ceremony proceeded. The chants were performed. The protections were placed. The family participated in the elements that the ceremony requires the patient's family to participate in. My cousin worked through the nights with the sustained, focused, physically demanding effort that 4-day ceremonies require, the hatale maintaining the ceremonial state for hours at a time, the concentration and the precision unbroken, the ceremony progressing through its stages, with the exactness that the tradition demands. The 3rd night was different. My cousin told me this much. He told me that on the 3rd night, something disrupted the ceremony. He did not tell me what happened. He said the details of what occurs during a ceremony are not for public discussion, even when the details include something that the ceremony did not anticipate and that the ceremony's protections did not fully contain. He said the disruption was significant. He said it required him to adjust the ceremony in real time, to draw on elements of his training that he had not previously needed to use, the deeper, older, more powerful elements that the Hadalai training includes. For situations where the standard ceremony encounters resistance that exceeds the standard ceremony's capacity, he completed the ceremony. He told me this with emphasis, the particular, the firm emphasis of a professional who wants it, understood that the work was finished and that the ceremony was not abandoned and that the 4 days were completed in their entirety. The ceremony was done. The protections were placed. Every element that the tradition required was performed. But my cousin also told me something else. He told me, sitting in my kitchen in Gallup on an evening about 2 weeks after the ceremony, drinking the coffee that I'd made and speaking in the quiet, measured, careful Navajo that he uses when he's discussing matters of professional significance, that the family moved within a month. They left the house near Crown Point. They moved to Albuquerque. The father transferred to a different position with the mining company. The mother took a new job. The children are enrolled in Albuquerque schools. The family left the reservation and the house and the community and the skylight through which the daughter had seen the shape crouching on the roof. I asked my cousin if the ceremony had worked. He was quiet for a long time. The particular, weighted, evaluative quiet that my cousin produces when he's choosing his words with the precision that the subject demands. He said the ceremony was completed correctly. He said the protections were placed correctly. He said every element of the ceremony was performed in the precise, correct, sequenced order that the tradition requires. He said the ceremony worked. Then he said, but the family moved. The space between those two statements, the ceremony worked and the family moved, is the space where the story lives. The ceremony worked, D, and the family moved. The protections were placed, D, and the family left. The tradition was followed, and the family went to Albuquerque. I pressed him. I asked him why the family would move if the ceremony worked. He looked at his coffee. He looked at the kitchen window where the evening light was coming in from the west. The particular amber light that Gala produces at dusk when the sun drops behind the mesas, and the sky goes gold, and then red, and then dark. He said some things are older than the ceremonies. He said it the way he says things that are important, without inflection, without drama, the weight carried by the words rather than by the delivery. Some things are older than the ceremonies. He said the ceremonies work against most things. He said most things with a particular emphasis that indicated the word most was chosen deliberately and that the word was doing important work in the sentence. The ceremonies work against most things, not all things, most things. He said there are entities that the tradition acknowledges and that the ceremonies address. The standard entities, the known forces, the disturbances that the tradition has identified and categorized and developed specific ceremonial responses for. The ceremonies work against these entities because the ceremonies were developed specifically to work against them. The chants and the prayers and the sand paintings calibrated to the specific nature of the specific threat. The ceremony is a precision tool designed for a precise purpose. And then he said there are entities that the tradition acknowledges and that the ceremonies cannot fully address. He said these entities are old, older than the ceremonies. He said the ceremonies were developed in response to these entities, the tradition recognizing their existence and creating the ceremonial tools to counter them. But he said the entities have had the same amount of time to develop responses to the ceremonies. The ceremonies are old. The entities are older. And in the time since the ceremonies were created, the entities have been learning the ceremonies the way the ceremonies learned the entities. The relationship between the ceremony and the entity is not static. It's an ongoing, evolving, adversarial relationship in which both sides adapt and both sides learn, and the advantage shifts, and the ceremonies that worked completely 100 years ago may work less completely now, because the entities have had 100 years to study what the ceremonies do and to develop countermeasures. My cousin didn't say what happened on the third night. He didn't describe the disruption. He didn't explain what he encountered during the ceremony that required him to use the deeper, older elements of his training. He said the details are not for public discussion. He said the ceremony was completed. He said the protections were placed. He said the work was done correctly. But the family moved. The house near Crown Point is empty now. The HUD house with the skylight stands vacant on the high desert 4 miles from town. The windows dark, the yard untended, the house showing the particular, rapid, visible decline that unoccupied houses on the reservation display. When the maintenance that daily occupation provides is withdrawn, and the desert begins reclaiming the structure. The skylight is still in the roof. The glass is still there. The skylight that the daughter looked through and saw the shape crouching on the roof is intact and transparent. Rattered and looking up at the sky from an empty house where nobody sleeps below it anymore. My cousin still performs ceremonies. He was called to 3 more this year. He travels across the eastern reservation to the communities that need his services, the families that are experiencing the disturbances that Western medicine doesn't recognize, and that the traditional medicine addresses. He performs the ceremonies correctly. He places the protections. He does the work. But he told me something in my kitchen that evening that I haven't been able to stop thinking about. He said the ceremonies are the best tools the tradition has. He said they work against most things. He said most things again with the same emphasis. And then he said the things that don't fully work against are the things that have been here the longest, the oldest things. The things that were here before the ceremonies were created, and that will be here after the last Hatale has performed the last ceremony. He said the tradition acknowledges these entities without claiming to control them. He said the ceremonies manage the relationship between the people and the entities, the ceremonies providing a framework for coexistence rather than a guarantee of dominance. He said the ceremonies are not walls, they're negotiations. And sometimes the negotiation produces a result that looks like the ceremony didn't work, even though the ceremony did exactly what it was designed to do, which is not to eliminate the entity, but to establish the terms under which the entity and the people occupy the same landscape. The family moved. The terms that the ceremony established were not the terms the family could live with. The entity, the family, and the ceremony arrived at an arrangement, and the arrangement was that the family would leave. My cousin says this is not a failure. He says the ceremony produced an outcome. The outcome was departure rather than destruction because the entity is older than the ceremony. Why and the ceremony cannot destroy what it was created to manage. The ceremony was managed. The family moved. The entity remains. In the house, on the roof, at the skylight, looking down through the glass at the empty rooms below, where a family used to sleep and where the tradition's best tools produced the best result they could produce, which was the family's safe departure from a place where something older than the ceremonies had decided to stay. The ceremonies are older than most of us. But some things are older than the ceremonies. That's what these stories tell us. Things that wear faces that don't quite fit. Things that run at speeds no animal should reach. Things that circle in the dark, counterclockwise, calling you by a name that only family knows. Which story kept you listening? Which one made you check the window? Tell us in the comments. And if you've seen something on the reservation roads, in the desert at night, or standing where nothing should be standing, we want to hear it. Send your story to nocturnaldread720@gmail.com. If this is your first time here, consider subscribing. We bring new horror stories every week, and the desert holds more than the daylight reveals. Some distances are maintained, not by fences, but by the careful practice of not looking. And some things, when you bring them close, stay close. Until next time, stay in the light. This has been Nocturnal Dread.